All right, everybody. How's it going? This is an early Friday evening live stream, and they're sort of refreshing in that I don't have to worry about putting the kids to bed. I don't have to worry about them misbehaving because they're all outside with my wife, which is nice. Okay, while everyone trickles in, I keep hearing comments to the effect that people are not getting notifications that the live streams are going live. So I tweeted it out. If everybody can tweet it out, let everybody know. It's going to be another, if I dare say so myself, first of all, everybody can hear me. It is going to be another amazing live stream. Robert Barnes, above and beyond being tremendously intelligent, is tremendously generous because I can count the hours that we have spent doing live streams together. It's not insignificant at this point. And whether or not I agree with him on everything, he's just amazingly knowledgeable. I see him coming in right now. So I said I would do the intro, then bring him up. Okay. So we're going to do three big topics, or three topics, and maybe some odd and ends questions. Ahmaud Arbery, there have been some developments. I want to go over them. I don't think they change much of the law, but I want to know if it changes anything in Robert's perspective. George Floyd, I've got tons of questions that I know Robert is going to be able to shed some light on. And then Michael Flynn, because that was the video I did this week, and I have. First of all, I want to know if I was out in left field with some of the things I said, or some of my assessment, and I need to know what Robert Barnes thinks of all of this. Robert Barnes, okay, you all know who he is. Everybody knows who he is. He's a regular, and I couldn't be more grateful that he does this. Flynn first, Fleet Lord Avatar. I don't know, Flynn. I think I want to do the one I think there's going to be the shortest amount of material on. Which I think is going to be Ahmaud Arbery because of the developments, but I don't know that it changes much of the law. What was I going to say? Yes, super chats. I'm going to do my best to get to all of them. If I do not get to them, I reserve the right to fail to be able to do that. Keep the discussion civil and friendly, and everybody's been very good in the super chat. Even the Russian sex bots have been very friendly and polite. Okay, without further ado, because we have not going to read. Okay, Barnes. Without further ado, get on with it. I need to give people time to come in because people don't get the notifications, and I like to go for a good 5 minutes. All right, I'm bringing him in. Robert is in the house. Robert, how you doing?
Good.
You might. Okay, I thought you were on mute, but it's there might be lag.
Yes.
Okay, we're good now. So I see the infamous fish tank in the back. You're still where are you now again?
Still in Texas.
And it's nice. Weather's good. Riots are not too bad.
My little sister was here, and then before she went back to Vegas, and I remember predicting at the time, I said I don't think they'll have riots here in Austin because I was presuming at the moment that this was partially BLM inspired more so than other things, and some other people, opportunists, taking advantage. And she said she thought otherwise because she was attributing more of it to Antifa. She was right because their problems in Austin did occur. Now, she had witnessed it. I mean, a couple of weeks before, she went into a local 7-Eleven, different context. It was the craziness of the pandemic. And the 7-Eleven, the woman behind the 7-Eleven register, saw a guy walk in without a mask. And she said, "You need to leave." And he's like, "I'm just here to buy something." And she said, "No, you need to leave." And he didn't. So she went and grabbed a baseball bat and chased him out of the store, threatening to beat him with a bat. And my little sister was like, "What?" So she was like, yeah, if that's the mentality here in Austin, there's probably going to be some riots just because of the pent-up frustration over the pandemic. And this is just an excuse to go out and act up. But so it's true. That's what happened.
That's amazing. And the funny thing is, I mentioned it, I think yesterday or maybe earlier this week, but there's a fish market here that now is requiring face masks. And it seems like the better things get, the more, the stricter and, more intense people get. And the pent up anger and energy. I mean, we're seeing it in Montreal. We're having riots on the street. There's been some looting, ostensibly for the George Floyd protest, but we all know that they don't have anything to do with that. And it's just, people have been sitting at home for 3 months. Now the weather's good, and now they have some energy to get out.
Well, it's truly a woke virus. It knows to invade the small mom and pop store, but not go into Walmart. I increasingly do believe it was a Chinese communist created virus because it favors companies that get their supplies from China, disfavors the small mom and pop shop with local produce or local or sourced products. And it knew that it's okay that if you go out and riot and loot or protest for certain causes, then the virus won't attack you. It magically goes away. It's only the people who are on the wrong political side, the virus, like I see you, and it just attacks you and gets you.
I mentioned that to someone in Montreal that, our government, which was shutting down businesses and not allowing them to reopen, the same government was literally giving advice on how to protest safely. And our doctor, I think her name is Dr. Tam, was saying, don't scream when you're out in the crowds, bang things together because screaming might spread more, but go out and protest. It's the most incoherent expert advice ever. It's amazing. Keep up the legal arguments. Love the glass-filled streets of West LA. And and the other thing, I forget, I think it was it Scott Adams who was saying, basically now there's been you can only buy stuff on one place, and it's Amazon. All of local retail has been wiped out, and lo and behold, someone is making a ton of money off of this. Okay, let's see this. Well, I know we're going to get into it. Okay, send the question to David at vivafry.com. And thank you very much, Chet. Okay, people are going to trickle in. 6.5 minutes in. Let's get into this because I don't know what your schedule's like tonight. Robert, the developments in Ahmaud Arbery. You've seen them?
Yeah, so I watched part of the hearing. The Law and Crime Network, which I occasionally commentate and write for, it's founded by Floyd Abrams' son, Dan Abrams, who does ABC News legal commentary. I've debated with him. Rachel Stockman runs the site. She's really nice, sweetheart. She's the daughter of David Stockman, famous OMB budget guy who has some independent political issues and had to deal with his own insane criminal prosecution many years ago. They did a live video because of the state court proceeding, unlike a federal court proceeding. They actually had live video up. So I watched part of the proceedings. I think it's about 7.5, 8 hours, the preliminary hearing they conducted there. It was an interesting political choice to go that route for the prosecution because in a lot of states, unlike the federal system, which requires generally grand jury by indictment by grand jury under the Fifth Amendment, in the states, you can skip the grand jury by doing a criminal complaint with a sworn out affidavit attached to it by a police officer. And then the court conducts the probable cause hearing instead of the grand jury. They call it a preliminary hearing. They often waive those, but smart lawyers will use them to develop intel and information. The prosecutor, I think, chose to go that path, maybe because they don't trust the local grand jury. That's a possibility. The other possibility is that that they think that they could get some PR out of the preliminary hearing, and they did. I would say from a factual perspective, the government's case was stronger after the preliminary hearing on Arbery because they have apparently racist statements attributed to both the son and the person who was following. Also, they explained better what was not explained initially as to why this third guy was charged. He apparently trapped Arbery and was following Arbery and wouldn't allow Arbery to even escape in different directions. So that explains why he was charged. I still think there's issues with the charge, but it makes a lot more sense than just he happened to be following him and videotaped it. The third, and there was a history of him making racist comments as well, at least according to the preliminary hearing. And then the third aspect is Arbery's behavior made a lot more sense. That he really was being tracked by two different vehicles, tried to escape in multiple different directions, and they wouldn't allow him by threatening the threat of violence with the car. So that makes his behavior, I still think, not a great decision, obviously, to rush a guy with a shotgun, but it makes more sense. In other words, his belief he was trapped was a legitimate belief. Now, there'll be the constant question, did he believe he was trapped because he was caught committing a crime in the past, or did he believe he was trapped because these guys are crazies? So that's a question we can't fully answer because he's not around. So we can just infer from the evidence. So I think the government's case got stronger. It was interesting to me what did not come out too, though. and that was strongest for the father. I assume that if they had any evidence if they had any new forensic evidence different than what the original prosecutor who passed on the case had, I figured they would present it. They did not present anything along those lines in terms of the gun, the time, how the gun went off, where it went off. It explains why they're bringing felony murder charges, just like they are, interestingly enough, in George Floyd's case. And then it also, but the other aspect was there was no problematic history with the father. So they apparently, and this is go ahead.
Actually, let me stop you there. No problematic history or no history?
That they didn't discuss anything about any allegations that he had used racist language, racist references, had made any racially biased statements. They've done a pretty expansive investigation. It's interesting where these thought crimes, where these thought crimes are going, because they apparently searched all of their cell phones, all of their social media, all of their emails. Typically, a search warrant would be limited to something relevant to the crime. But I presume their theory was they were going to say that their motivation could not have been a reasonable suspicion of a felony, because instead they were motivated by racial hatred or racial bias. And that, I guess, opened the door for them to probably look at almost every single communication they've ever had, because otherwise that's a mighty broad search warrant that they executed. The only other thing I would say on the defense side of the aisle is that the cop, I only watched part of his cross-examination, but he was unduly defensive about things he didn't have to be defensive about. To give an example, they were just asking how long he was at the judge's when he gave the judge oral testimony beyond his written affidavit to swear out the initial warrants. And he played a lot of games with how long he was there. And it took forever for them to just get him to admit, well, was it longer than 2 or 3 minutes? Okay, maybe. Well, was it more than an hour and a half? Well, maybe it was less than an hour. It's like, what? He didn't know how long he was there. He didn't have a range. I'm not buying. The guy's a 19-year officer. So if he would be defensive about that.
If I stop you there for 1 second, sorry. The 19-year officer is the guy recording, right?
No, so this is the cop investigating the McMichaels.
Okay.
So this is the prosecutor's main witness at the preliminary hearing. And so he swore out a warrant. He's the one who swore out the warrant to get the arrest and was part of the process of skipping the grand jury to go to this preliminary hearing and then go to trial if the judge says that probable cause has been met at the preliminary hearing. He was the only government witness to my knowledge. He was on the stand a long time, and sometimes a lot of cops will be defensive. What I'll say in his defense is that he did not. He's not a smooth liar, so he's not a trained liar. He's not a guy who lies a lot. He's not Mark Furman from the OJ case. You can look that up as part of the research for that discussion.
I remember who he is.
That's a man who could lie smooth. This guy's not that at all. But on the flip side, the fact that he was so defensive about something so basic. Now, it gets a high-profile case, so that may explain why. But it told me watching him, I was like, there's going to be more government misconduct in this case. There's something they're sitting on that they push the envelope on. Maybe they got a search warrant. Maybe they searched some stuff before they had a warrant. Maybe they searched more stuff than they were supposed to. Maybe that's going to be there is going to be a government misconduct angle to this case, will be my early prediction. But there's no question the case again on the Arbery side of the aisle got stronger because they have racist statements being made or accused of both the son and the third person being made against them, who are the strongest instigators, because the father was just in the passenger seat and then in the back of the truck cab. He never pulled his gun. He never shot his gun. Sorry. Sorry. I got to drink some.
In fact, and now when you do that, I actually one thing. Okay. Before that, I'm confused on the identity or the relationship of the guy recording, the third person. Now it turns out that he was in a vehicle that was also chasing Arbery. And then during the additional evidence, it came out that someone struck Arbery with the vehicle and it caused damage to the right-hand side of the vehicle. Was that the McMichaels car or was that the video recording guy's car?
Video recording guy.
Okay.
So what happens, the video recording guy, and the other thing is, it's sort of his defense, but I found it a peculiar defense, but his argument is that he just followed what the father did. And so he knew who the father was. He knew that the the father was someone who was sort of the community watch guy because he had the lifetime in law enforcement. Secondly, he said that he did think Arbery looked like the guy he had seen. Apparently, that video footage from inside the house, the house under construction, that showed someone that appears to be Arbery on 3 prior occasions. Apparently, that had been shared throughout the neighborhood in their home, whatever their association network, home neighborhood association was. So he saw that. He thought it looked like him. Then he saw the father and the son jump in the truck, and he thought, oh, they have him. So he followed him. But he didn't just follow him. He helped trap Arbery. When Arbery tried to go through some woods, he did something with the car that led to Arbery having contact with his car. And so he did more than just film it at the end. And so it explains why they went at him. Now, that guy was also dumb enough to yip to the police. So he obviously didn't think he did anything wrong. What's interesting is this whole case, my guess is, looking at it now, neither that guy nor the son will take the stand, is my early prediction. They'll hinge the whole case on the father. Because if they don't have any allegations of racism against the father, and both of them were, even from the government's narrative, it sounds like everybody was following the father as to why they thought they had reasonable suspicion. And the father's the one with the life experience, and the father is the one with the prior knowledge of Arbery. And he probably will come across the best. I think the son would have a hard time taking the stand, given the scope of racially hateful things he apparently, this is just by the evidence alleged so far, but said a lot of racially hateful and violent things. There's going to be, now the interesting thing is here, whether that comes into evidence, probably an open question. It's at some degree, it's secondhand hearsay, not sure how they'll introduce it. But it really comes down, and there'll be probably a prejudice versus probative value question about it. But I assume the government's theory is that you can disbelieve their claim of reasonable suspicion because of their racially biased motivation. Which the interesting thing to me there is, at least in theory, a racist could also have reasonable suspicion of a crime. But down deep, we're not really going to tend to believe them because we so dislike morally their racism. And we already dislike the consequences of what took place here. So I think they're going to have the son. I think the son and the third guy are going to have a hard time with the jury, unless the jury can really distinguish those two factors, which I think are hard. Now, but if they don't have anything else against the father, it's almost like they're blaming the father for just being in the truck. And the father, so I think the father probably testifies. The father has the strongest defense. I would say right now, better than 50-50, the father gets acquitted. Less than that for both the son and the third man. I think that it's because of their history of racial bias in text and comments, unless that does not come into evidence, or some of that presentation isn't quite what they made it out to be at the preliminary hearing. But I mean, the kind of statements he made were pretty extraordinary statements, if true. I mean, they expressed extreme violence, violent thoughts towards black men.
What and I don't want to lose my track of thought, but who said what when Arbery was on the ground and after he had been hit by the car? It was the third cameraman guy?
No, that's purportedly the son. The son said, used the N-word and then said something about, good he got him or good he was dead. Now, I think that statement is the least likely to come into evidence because that sounded like secondhand hearsay. And it was also, just by watching the video, my thought process was that couldn't have been a contemporaneous statement because they weren't in earshot of him at the time. So I suspect that statement was meant for the prelim to inflame the public in the court of public opinion. But not only to inflame the public, but also how many people are really going to back these guys now? You're going to see a lot of the people in the court of public opinion stay away from defending these guys. There'll be about 20% of the group that's doing it will still do so. But about 80% will be like, look, there's a lot of people I can defend in the court of public opinion. Why do I get to defend 2 or 3 guys who are clear racist, who had one of whom expressed the worst part really wasn't that statement in my view. It was from looking at it, from judging and assessing it, it was statements of racial violence that he had made long before then over the years to friends and other people. I was like, well, that suggests a certain mindset that when we don't have on video whether he approached Arbery, all we see is we see them somehow hitting each other in the front center of the truck. We don't know whether he walked toward him, because that would change things. For example, then Arbery's not just making a 90-degree turn. Arbery's reacting to him coming at him with the gun. So I think that now, again, the whole case legally, this was explained by the defense lawyers making arguments at the prelim. Particularly the third guy, he made the strongest arguments at the prelim, I think, in the crazy hope that maybe the judge would do something. The judge, by the way, looked like he was near dead. I don't know how old that guy is, but how he's still on the bench, I had no idea. But I was looking up there, I was like, man, I would not be inspired if that was my judge. I had a judge in Tennessee who kept sleeping on the bench, drove me nuts. But there's no way that judge is going to grant a dismissal in a case like this. There was zero chance of it. That's why he's sleeping through. He's like, I already know what I'm going to do. I don't care what the evidence is. It's just a preliminary hearing in their mind. So and there's not a lot of people defending the McMichaels in the community. I mean, there's some, but not very loud. There's going to be a lot fewer now when they discovered the two of the three have. And to be honest, a lot of people are going to think, if the son had that many racially hateful comments that he just said it casually on social media or with friends, what's the odds the father didn't have some of those same attitudes? That's going to implicate the police and the prosecutors. There's another reason why they may not have gone into the father's history. If he does have a history, do they want to expose that? Because that would be 18 years of criminal investigations and prosecutions that could be reopened tomorrow.
This is where people are going to scream, and rightly so, corruption as to potentially why the McMichaels were never charged in the first place, because this is the can of worms that an investigation and an indictment would have opened up.
Right.
Robert, this is going to be true in this case. It's going to be true in George Floyd. What do you say now? Like, what's the chances, or what is going to be done of spoiling or poisoning the jury pool? Like, how are these people going to get an impartial jury now that everybody in America knows, and they've probably formed a very radical opinion already?
Yeah, the utility of that, hypothetically, is that you get meaningful voir dire. You get meaningful jury selection when this occurs. You get to ask tons and tons of questions, because the hardest part of any criminal case or any civil case, to be honest, is not getting to know your jury. Now, here's what's not going to happen. They're not going to transfer the venue. Mm-hmm. The Supreme Court made a ludicrous decision, in my view, in the Enron case. There you had 2/3 of the jury pool admitting they basically hated Enron, and yet somehow that made it okay for most of them to sit on the jury. And the Supreme Court said, that's all right. That isn't completely incurable. I mean, they just made it a joke. Everybody saw that, and they realized no judge in the country now is going to move a case. Because if the Supreme Court said you could try Enron in Houston, then by golly, there's nobody that's going to ever have more contamination than Enron did. Even this case is not going to have more contamination than Enron, because in the Enron case, they negatively impacted 2/3 of the community, directly or indirectly, in their behaviors, as well as scorched earth media coverage, books, documentaries, novels, films, you name it. So they're not going to be able to move the case. Now, I sometimes make that argument, and I did it in Snipes, and I do it solely for the purposes of trying to force the judge to give me jury selection, because I know he's not going to move it. But I want to force one of the solutions to the court say is, hey, you don't have to move it because you can do real detailed jury selection. And all I want in a case is jury selection. And to be honest, they're better off getting detailed jury selection in the local community than they are moving it to a random jury where they don't get jury selection. So in both Minnesota and the rest, I think they'll get detailed jury selection. The question is how honest people are. We saw in the Roger Stone case, they were not honest, in my view. Those jurors did not. They knew what the information people were trying to get at, and they played coy with their answers. And then the judge covered for them, because that's the nature of that case. So you still have risks like that. You have to scream a lot. To give you an example, in the Snipes case, despite the media coverage that had already occurred, when I first appeared in the case, which was 3 months prior to trial, the federal judge said, it's never taken me more than an hour to sit a jury and 30 years on the bench. I don't think this case is going to be any different. Well, when I was done, he ended up doing 3 days of jury selection. So but that required some, creative activities. There are ways. So I think if they're smart, they'll get good jury selection, and I think they both can get a fair jury if they do really good jury selection. But contrary to a lot of conventional wisdom, I think the Arbery case is a higher conviction rate than I believed before, based on the evidence. I mean, they found the smoking gun evidence they needed, evidence that at least 2 of the 3 people were motivated. But the people that were driving the vehicles and that had the gun that went off had long-standing racial animus, demonstrated in a wide range of contexts. Now, what's funny is in the OJ case, people drew a different conclusion from that. I mean, Mark Furman sued the police department saying, by the way, I'm such an incurable racist. I'm handicapped and I'm disabled. And I was like, either the guy's a compulsive liar and he's making it up to get easy cash, or he really is a compulsive racist who doesn't need to be on the police force. And magically, he finds almost all the evidence in the case. So, but in my view, when you have real evidence of racial animus like that, that's deeply problematic, particularly because juries don't really make factual decisions. I know our legal system pretends that they do. The reality is they make moral decisions. White hat, black hat, good, bad. And they're just not going to want to acquit white guys who had racial hatred in their hearts, who are at least at some level responsible for the death of a young black man. So I think they're going to get convicted. Maybe the father walks. Floyd, the head guy's definitely going down.
Okay, so before we get there, because that actually that's a whole other discussion as well. Madam Von Kook says, would the Stanley Milgram's authority experiment Stanford Prison Study, Ash, be a viable defense for the officers who murdered George Floyd? We're going to get to that. I saw one more. David March says someone needs to make the Wesley Snipes case into a movie. No one would believe it. Is there a good book on it?
Not yet. The Good Doctor has his own copyright involved. So it's whenever he wants to do something, he'll do it. He tends to be I ran into him at a boxing match in New York City a couple of months ago. He was in good spirits as usual. It was a good boxing match too. My son was with me. He was all thrilled because he'd heard the stories, but he had never met him. And Snipes has this like voodoo reaction that people have to the guy, even more so in person because he has an intense aura. But so it's going to be up to him. But yeah, absolutely. There's many aspects to that case that are extraordinary and that are out of a book or a movie. I got like 5 or 6 of those, but I remember there were a bunch of people that wanted to film me in LA in the Hollywood culture. And I was like, the problem is 2/3 of the good stuff you can't film and can't show because, that's attorney-client confidential behavior.
Okay. So it's amazing. Now I think that for Arbery, that's obviously very important material developments that are going to change whatever ambiguity might have surrounded what everyone visually saw. Let's go to George Floyd. So 27 minutes in, I just want to see if I can timestamp these things. George Floyd, someone's got to explain this to me. We've talked about it in previous vlogs. My understanding in Canadian criminal law, you can go after first-degree murder, and if you don't get that, you can get the lesser and included charges.
Yep.
How do they decide between third degree murder, second degree murder, and not going after first degree, at the very least for Chauvin?
The reason is because felony murder is easy. It's the same reason why they're doing it in the Arbery case. So in second degree murder in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, under Minnesota state law, is just felony murder. Well, there's other aspects too. It could be something other than felony murder, but they're pursuing a felony murder case. So they realized to bring in the other people. Here's the problem. If they go after Chauvin for intentional murder, it's very hard to go after the others for felony murder because they're trying to claim all of these guys are committing a felony, which result in the murder. And so for them, they want the other people held as responsible as Chauvin. If they go in and say, you know what, Chauvin is just a complete ass and he deliberately murdered the guy.
The other 3 get off.
Correct, or at least more likely to. Theoretically, they could still be held responsible, but then there becomes a disconnect in the causative chain.
So, I mean, that's interesting. So if they go after murder 1 for Chauvin and they say, okay, it was premeditated, but none of the other 3 knew that it was premeditated. At some point, they get wise to what's going on. But if they go and try to prove that against Chauvin, then it lets the other 3 off. Whereas if they go with second degree, they can still get all the other 3 on felony murder because they contributed to the felonious act.
Yep.
Okay, that's a very interesting explanation because I watching it, I say, okay, for first degree murder, it's got to be premeditated. We all appreciate that. Did Chauvin wake up that morning saying he was going to go kill George Floyd in particular? Probably not. But in my mind, I'm thinking after 2 minutes of what he's doing, he knows what he's doing. So if that's not premeditation, or if it doesn't become premeditation about 2 minutes into what he knows what he's doing, why not? So I guess the argument is it could have been, but they decided strategically not to, so they can go after the other 3 for felony murder charges.
It's definitely if I was defending the other cops, I might be inclined to pursue an intentional murder theory against Chauvin as almost a defense. I would say it'd be like I would say, look, they thought he was in control, didn't realize he had this nefarious intent. They didn't realize. I mean, my argument, like there's some people wanting to defend Chauvin. Chauvin fits the definition of what I've talked about earlier in this on our prior live streams. If you want to see a civil rights case and you want to know whether the cop trying to figure out what was in the cop's head, look at the cop's history. Bad cops have a long history. There's been a lot of surveys and studies on this, but I've done it on my own cases. Same as domestic violence cases, right? If you're trying to figure out whether he said, she said, we'll just look at the guy's history, or in some cases her history, but more often the guy's. And if the guy has a history of women saying the same thing about him, then he did it again in all likelihood. By contrast, if every other woman he's ever been with says that didn't happen, by the way, hint, hint, that's the O.J. Simpson case, then maybe it didn't quite happen the way people are saying it happened. So in this case, this guy had 18 prior complaints against him, 18, almost 6 problematic shootings he had been involved in. The reason why he was on the street as long as he was is because the would-be vice president of the United States, the New York Times recommended president of the United States, the current senator from the state of Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar, kept him in power, kept that officer in power, kept him from being prosecuted, kept him from being disciplined. It's my theory as to part of the reason why these riots occurred, and to some degree. The media and the Democratic Party could not afford the Floyd case to get into detail about how that happened, because the number one reason is a bad cop was kept on the street long after they had every reason to know he was a deeply troubled individual. There's the other cops too, by the way, also bad histories, beating up guys with pregnant women, all kinds of crazy stuff. But the Chauvin, horrid history, one of the worst rap sheets any cop could have, no business being on the streets. And yet the only reason he was is because Klobuchar kept him there. Now, when that's the person that Biden is considering for vice president, when that's the person the New York Times said should be president of the United States, it doesn't surprise me that all of a sudden there's a shift in the agenda to not get into details about George Floyd's case.
So help me understand that, because it's the first time I've heard that. And when people say, like when my reflex is when people try to blame something on a politician, there has to be some like specific knowledge, not just the general knowledge of managing the police force. Did she have some specific knowledge of this problematic cop in particular?
Oh, yes. Chauvin was people wanted him prosecuted for a shooting in which he and 3 other officers put 43 holes into the guy in his vehicle within about a 15-second span. And there was a lot of reason. And by that point, Chauvin already had prior police complaints against him for abuse and misconduct. So the local NAACP wanted Klobuchar, when she was prosecutor, to prosecute him. She reviewed the case and she said, no prosecution. I don't find he did anything wrong. I'm not even going to refer him to discipline. The number one reason we have abusive police in the United States is because prosecutors cover for him and police departments cover for him. It's by far, whenever I've had a case of a bad cop doing something crazy, there will have always been, in fact, there hasn't been a single instance where that hasn't been the case yet, any case I've ever had. There has always been a record, always been a history of complaints. These guys are usually complained about within a year on the job because they're the sociopaths who seek out police work. I always say it's not the police's fault that the nature of their work invites sociopaths to apply, but it's a reality that they need to deal with if they're going to police the police. But the number one reason, I bring these cases to the attention of prosecutors right away. I bring them to the attention of police departments right away. Now, in a place like Chattanooga, where I have a lot of political friends and allies, my hometown in Tennessee, I can get people to do something. But in most other places, they don't care. And in fact, usually they'll go to great lengths to cover it up.
Okay. I actually want to ask you why, but I want to just get these 3 super chats because one of them I think you'll be able to answer. What defenses would you say that Chauvin and the other cops have in the Floyd case? Do you think Floyd's family is having Crump as an attorney hurts them? We'll get to that in a second, because I think for Chauvin, I think you've made it clear what defenses he doesn't have, but for the others, it's sort of implied what defenses they might have. Can the jury in the Floyd case bring back a higher charge after a guilty finding? They can't find a charge guiltier than that for which he was charged, right?
Nope. Ed, that's either the grand jury or by criminal complaint after preliminary hearing, depending on the process. But it's considered a deviation from the indictment, and you're not allowed to do that. So you're only allowed to convict on that which either a grand jury or court has passed on and has already decided has probable cause of.
Okay, and now this, I've been getting a lot of questions, and I think SSG Lesser asked me yesterday and sent me an email. We're gonna discuss the similarities or the dissimilarities of the Tony Timpa case. So I'll get to that. Someone remind me if I don't get to it. And then we got, will Chauvin et al. Personnel files be admissible? This is going to go hand in hand with the next question. Why would a prosecutor cover for the cops? Is it because they want to avoid bad publicity? It costs too much to get them off. The union defends the cops. Why? What is the incentive not to do this reflexively?
It's all of the above, but primarily, well, I'll give you the non-conspiratorial version, then give you the conspiratorial version. The non-conspiratorial version is that the institutional nature of being a prosecutor is you're not self-reflective. You instinctively defend any police because you see them as on your team, on your side, so that you see any accusation against them as one against your own family or a close partner. And so you defend them accordingly, reflexively, and with a knee-jerk reaction, and you look for every excuse possible. And unless there's overwhelming evidence that they're guilty, you're not going to bring the prosecution. Conspiratorial version would be that the political classes that be want some bad cops because bad cops are useful in the way mobs are useful. That sometimes you want a bad cop to break some knees, break some elbows, break some arms. You want that to go in and handle the tough crowd, quote unquote. A lot of your bad cops are like Mark Furman. They have records of high rates of conviction, high rates of investigation, high rates of taking a case from being an open file to being a closed file. They usually know how to play the game. So that's the more conspiratorial version. The best show on this that I recommend for anybody to understand policing in America, particularly in urban centers, is watch The Wire. It's about 5-season episodes. It also gets into the media and the rest, but it's fantastic. And it captures the mindset of how even innocent cops can lose it. Now, as to what the defenses are, I can imagine the narrative for Chauvin in the Floyd case and the other officers. I think there's separate narratives. But for him, it's going to be, hey, I showed up. This guy's acting crazy. He won't behave. We try to put him in the back of the car. He's screaming and pushing and trying to punch and everything else. We couldn't do anything to control him. So we just get him on the ground and just try to stay on him because the moment we relax, he would go crazy again. And he'll probably do a long version of, I've been through this a lot. And this one time, this guy grabbed the knife. And this other time, this guy was able to grab a gun, etc. It's, good luck with that. The problem, there's parts of that are true, but here's the main counter. Floyd is the way to reform in Floyd's case is simple, aside from not having bad cops on the force when you know they're bad cops. The second is, for a long time, a lot of the suits I've been bringing, we need to incorporate better mental and medical health in our response, and we need to not burden police with being mental and medical health professionals. Now, as Brandon Tatum, co-founder of Blexit, but he also was a great football player back in the day. He was actually a police officer for a while in Texas for a long time. And he explained right away, he said, look, as a police officer, we were trained in excited delirium and other things that like it. He's like, you show up, Floyd, like this is my main argument to other people. Clearly they knew Floyd was behaving irrationally and needed mental health from the time of the 911 call, because the 911 calls, they're not calling in because they're really bothered by $20 in counterfeit cash or the cigarettes going out. They're bothered because they're saying something's wrong with this guy. He came back and he did this and he's just sitting in the car and there's something wrong with him. So they're recognizing a mental health problem. And when the police show up, you have to really know it's a mental health problem because he's still there. He hasn't fled. He hasn't left. He's still acting weird and he's still there knowing the police were called. So at that point, you had to know, and I guarantee you some of those officers, I know they've been likely trained in excited delirium, which is a state that happens when you may be experiencing a kind of overdose effect of things like fentanyl, of things like meth, of other drugs you can be on, where you're going through an excited stage. If people Google it, excited delirium, you'll see a lot of Floyd's behavior. So they know that Floyd's behavior is not criminally resisting arrest. This is someone who who's having mental problems, who's behaving in a counterproductive, irrational manner. And I'm sure to some degree Chauvin knew that. Chauvin was one of those cops, in my view, who liked being a cop because he liked being the boss. And that's what people saw in that just short visual.
No, when he stares up and stares at the crowd and says, "I'm doing this, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop me."
Exactly. It's why it was so inflammatory. The white guy with his knee on the neck of the black man showing he doesn't give a damn is the way he's responding to the people. And I have no doubt that's who that guy is. And so that's where but the big mistake, the reason why he doesn't have much of a defense is because he's been trained to recognize excited delirium. He's been trained to involve a medical health response in that circumstance and situation. He's been trained to know the difference. I mean, I brought one of these cases in Wisconsin. A guy committed armed robbery. It was not the worst kind of armed robbery. Basically went with his buddy. His buddy insisted that the ex had stuff that was really his, domestic dispute situation. Turned out not to really be his, but that kind of dynamic. And my guy was a relatively, as criminals go, not too mean a guy. He confessed right away. Police pulled him over. He's like, yeah, screwed up. My buddy there was wrong. But he was an epileptic. He gets taken into the jail. He tells them, I haven't had my shot or any epilepsy treatment in almost a day, which was already a problem. Of course, they do nothing about it. And then he starts experiencing seizures, banging his head against the floor, starts urinating on himself, defecating on himself. Well, the geniuses at the Milwaukee County jail system decided that meant he was resisting arrest because he just wanted to make them smell his self-defecation and self-urination. And so they basically picked him up and treated him like a garbage bag, and how they walked him around the jail, took him over to the hospital, then got him right out of the hospital. He started experiencing conditions all over again, treated him even worse all the way back, ended up dead. Brought the case, and when you go through it, you find out they're all trained on this stuff to recognize the big difference between a mental health issue and a criminal resistance issue. Now, here would be the best defense for the cops. They do experience people who fake medical conditions as a way to try to resist arrest. But there are clear, easy ways to distinguish it. And just the fact that Floyd when you have the 911 call plus Floyd is still there when he knew they called the police, by my understanding, then the guy is behaving in a manner that's a mental health issue, that's likely a drug overdose issue. So your obligation at that point, protect and serve, is to get immediate medical health treatment. And instead, they beat him up and killed him. So I don't think they're going to win their defense.
Well, and this actually is going to lead into the next question. Before I get there, does the police union have to play a role in the defense of the officers? I think the answer is yes. Mm-hmm. Sir, how good is the shield for realism?
Mm-hmm. Extremely good. Extremely good.
Okay, so here's my question. I mean, my imagining is that the only defense that might exist for Chauvin is Floyd died of something totally unrelated, purely spontaneous, and just bad coincidence that it happened when he had his knee on his neck for 9 minutes. And I say good luck with that. The question now is, though, and I know people are asking this, the police autopsy comes out and confirms that the death was not asphyxiation or strangulation. Whether or not you believe that, does that weaken the prosecution's case?
Two different components. I mean, in terms of the autopsy still also concluded that they believe they could not rule out that part of the cause of his heart attack was the restraint, him being put under restraints, and the whole condition that was happening to him. So they'll be able to get past that issue. That's why they also charge felony murder, because that makes the whole incident part of why he dies. And they can't, even the autopsy doesn't rule that out. It says the combination of his drug condition and the nature of his restraints and the police conduct, they don't know which cause. It's like a true cause of death rather than our COVID-19 causes of death. Normally there's 3 or 4 possible causes, but that will be sufficient for them in front of the jury. Their biggest, and that'll be part of the defense, I'm sure. But the real part of the defense will be a moral undercurrent, which will be, hey, this guy was a dangerous criminal who was behaving like a crazed man on drugs, who they were just trying to control and wanting it to all be calm. Their main defense won't really be that defense, so that will be the one in court. Their main defense will be all the riots that are happening. So because that case I just talked about that I had in Milwaukee, had to settle the case before it reached the jury because I realized the jury was going to vote 12-0 against me. Because even though they saw horrific video evidence 10 times as bad as Floyd's, they were still going to walk because they have been convinced in their heads that all of the black BLM narratives are all bogus and false because they've seen a lot of them turn out bogus and false. It's my view. I'm extremely negative towards BLM because they've made my job in civil rights harder, and I've seen it and lived it in cases all across the country. So that's their biggest risk. The biggest risk is jury selection of a jury that, especially in light of Floyd's name being connected to riots and all the looting taking place, says, you know what, down deep, I kind of want that cop on that wall to be, Jack Nicholson, A Few Good Men. Yeah, maybe he's a little rough. Yeah, maybe he's a little mean, but this was a bad guy anyway. And because they were going to do it in my case, in which they had far less reason to do so. And and some of the people knew me on the jury pool. Were like, hey, I really like you, so on and so forth. Well, why did you follow the case? But, the nature of the animal. But I noticed it. I noticed it midway through because of how they were responding to the most horrifying video that I had tested with focus groups and got 90% positive, for our side of the aisle responses. People were just outraged when they would see the video. The way they just dropped him when he was going to be dead about 2 minutes later. Treated him literally like a garbage bag, filled with the worst garbage in it. And so if that could happen in Milwaukee, Minneapolis, not a lot different. Now you add all of the violence. But what I got a backlash to BLM. I got jurors around there like, I'm not going to convict no matter what. I'm not. And that was just a civil case. They didn't even have to find criminal responsibility. They were like, I'm not going to give them a penny because these are all a bunch of fraudsters and scam artists who just want to divide everybody, who push bogus cases and fake narratives. And I'm not going to buy anything. Even if I like the lawyer involved, I'm just not going to buy it. He's just, he's caught up as part of this case. I'm going to make a statement. And the other statement will be a thin blue line. People should watch the documentary, A Thin Blue Line. It's about how that was abused. To go back to your earlier question about why prosecutors would do this, well, there was a phrase back in Houston, Texas, talked about in that documentary, The Thin Blue Line, where they railroaded an innocent guy. That's where the line came from. The prosecutor said, this is a thin blue line, and he used it to inflame the jury to convict an innocent man. But they used to say in Harris County, and the prosecutors there, they used to say any prosecutor can convict a guilty man. It takes an exceptional prosecutor to convict an innocent one. And it was their joke. That gives you an idea of the mindset of some of these folks. So unfortunately, there's going to be a backlash coming. Every case like this is why Arbery has the McMichaels have a chance to walk. Even Chauvin has a chance to walk. They all have a chance to walk because if it happens, it'll be because a bad jury was selected that's in a backlash mindset because of what happened, because of the riots and the looting.
Very interesting. Okay, now incidentally, Chet Chisholm says, as a paramedic, I can confirm it's very difficult to restrain someone who's in excited delirium. We had a woman that took 2 RCMP, 3 medics, and all the benzos. Well, I say he was already handcuffed behind his back by that point anyhow when the incident occurred. But I mean, I sort of have some experience knowing that is true as well. When they arrest him, or when Chauvin shows up, do they know Floyd's priors? Do they know his criminal history?
Maybe. My guess is the cops will say they did. So because their life's on the line. So and so that could function into it, and they'll do anything possible to get in his history. And this is where I always complain about. I particularly don't like BLM because BLM tends to take a case like the case I had. Right, my guy committed armed robbery. I wasn't going to go in there and tell him, hey, you know what? He was a saint. He was helping to raise orphans in between traveling to Africa and free starving kids. I wasn't going to do that story. Right? The BLM likes to take the Rosa Parks narrative, except they have the drunk bum who wants to sit on the front of the bus. Well, the drunk bum has the right to sit on the front of the bus too, but he's not the best person to bring a case like Rosa Parks is. But they want him to be a drunk bum, pretend he's Rosa Parks, and in my view, they're deliberately taking cases with bad facts because, and I don't think that's what happened in Floyd, but I think in other cases they do. But they have this natural tendency, they built in a narrative to tell everybody, if you want to do a GoFundMe, anything else, portray them as a wonderful, perfect, pristine individual. All this does is lead to backlash, where people think, hold on a second, I thought Ahmaud Arbery really was just one of the great joggers of South Central Georgia. I really did believe that George Floyd was a evangelical Christian leading a small church group to play basketball on the streets on Saturdays. I don't like that. It's like, look, a lot of these guys are guys that are going to have problematic histories. They have the same civil rights as every other human being. And those bad cops, if you think they limit themselves to the George Floyds of the world, you're wrong. It's another part where I disagree with BLM because they're taking away part of the moral uniting energy we can to have real police reform. But I think that's Floyd's history. They're going to want to get in because it's very inflammatory. And again, it goes to the moral narrative. This case will be a moral narrative. The factual narrative convicts them. So, but the prosecutor is Ellison, which I hope he doesn't personally do the case, but he's such a grandstander, he won't be able to help himself. Ellison is the one who had the Antifa book and tweeted it out to the world that Donald Trump was afraid of Antifa and how much he loved it. His son just said he joins Antifa. His son is saying defund the police. So if Ellison is anywhere near, now Ellison's ego is big, so that might keep him away from prosecuting the case. If he was smart, he'd have somebody like me prosecute the case. And because, pick someone with the right skill set, right background, but that isn't associated with the political left, that's ideally associated with being pro-police. So an old school prosecutor could also work, and who can just present the story as is. Because the truth of this story is at least two, the Chauvin and the one other guy, when I read his history, and he's the main one that's involved in punching Floyd in the back. There's no form of medical health that says punching someone in the face is a successful means of detention. So also, this was a minor crime issue. They really were not called out to put him in jail. They were called out because they were worried about him because they thought something was wrong with him. Now, here's where we can have institutional reform. For a long time, those of us have been advocating start to shift resources. Not every 911 call should go to the police. Some of those 911 calls should go to medical and mental health professionals that are trained to deal with it. And at least be, even if it's a combined criminal matter and mental health, have a mental health person and an ambulance there at the same time. Because if they're there, like that EMT was talking about, it may be tough to detain him, but they know how to do so in such a way not to make his health worse. Now, Chauvin, no one's going to convince me that Chauvin, that look was just such a harsh look. There was too much expressed in that demeanor, facial disposition, length of time. We can't ever know anyone else's mind, but we can see their behavior and make reasonable inferences from it. And I'm not convinced he did anything but enjoy the power of that moment. And he had 18 prior complaints, so it's not like the guy just fell off had a bad day.
Okay, totally understand. Any chance of jury maxification? What does that mean?
I assume they're meaning an opposite of jury nullification, where the jury goes up. But no, unfortunately. No. Well, my own view is felony murder. I don't like felony murder. I still don't like felony murder. I think it's a bogus charge. I think it invites crazy rules, etc. But putting that aside for the moment, he can serve up to 40 years in prison. So there's not, like, the difference between that and first degree is, okay, he gets out at 82 versus he never gets out. I'm not worried about Chauvin at 82 years old. So,
okay, interesting. We got Life of Brian says murder one, given that they work together as security guards in a dirty bar, counterfeiting money. Also, police unions control elections and prosecutions. The question is whether or not they had something of a personal relationship, personal history, which I know what I think, but I would never dare say it publicly because I have no knowledge. But when it became disclosed that they worked as bouncers at another nightclub, I don't believe for a second they didn't know each other, because I believe that, in fact, I had a discussion with a friend who said it makes Nate Brody said it makes total sense they would know each other. Bouncers need to know other bouncers working at a nightclub.
Yeah, and Minneapolis is not that big of a town. The other aspect there too is that his sort of demeanor and disposition. Well, put it this way: it's the way Hunter Thompson described it. Hunter Thompson used to say, "The Hell's Angels are just cops who didn't get employed by the police force." And his description was how police, a lot of your street cops and gangs, think the same way. They just happen to be on the opposite side of the line, have the same instincts. So I think that may have been in play there as well. There may be another backstory. In other words, maybe he felt embarrassed or humiliated. Whatever's happening, he's acting like, look at me, I have the power. Though his physical posture, his demeanor, his disposition, the length of time he's doing it. I mean, they take his pulse, and he stays on top of him after they've taken the pulse, and clearly they know he's dead by that point because he hasn't breathed. They take the way they're reacting to each other, and then they have police show up, and when they're putting in the ambulance, it appears to actually be police, not actual ambulance.
Yeah, so, I mean, someone pointed that out. I didn't actually notice that the first time. I wasn't sure about the properness of that actual fact. And I wasn't sure if I was visually seeing some things wrong. They were 2 armed police officers that stepped out of the ambulance and not EMTs, right?
Correct. Exactly. Which that's I've never heard of that. So my hunch is they called a special group in to. They probably gave them a different pretext, but basically it was, hey, we may have a crowd control issue here. Come in an ambulance rather than a police car. Pick this guy up and stick him on the. And they were trying to pretend he was not dead. When to me, I think they knew he was dead by when they were checking his pulse. That's why all of it's going to make it look worse. Now that doesn't mean I think the other 2 cops who don't necessarily have as long a history, if they're also lower on the hierarchy, I'm not sure how much they could have done. In other words, were they supposed to? I still would have liked them to do something, but there's a big difference between really screwing up and thinking you're committing felony murder. So I think those 2 may have the strongest defense, depending on how the facts develop here on out.
Yeah, someone's saying that one of them was on the force for 4 days.
Yeah, so the rookie probably's got the best defense.
Okay, now SSG Lester says, would it be better for America if they would nationalize the police brutality for all other races instead of...
Oh, of course. I think he means universalize it. Absolutely. You can listen to Professor Lowry at Princeton, who was on recently trying to argue to a lefty, or Lord Jamar, who has his own criticism about BLM, famous rapper. But Professor Lowry laid out, he said, look, we need to universalize these issues because, one, they are a matter of universal concern. Police abuse doesn't discriminate in that way. It may have a disproportionate number of African-American victims, though the evidence for that is actually not that strong. But even if presuming it did, it still hurts more non-Black people than Black people every year, just by demographics. And then the second part he pointed out is by making it a divisive issue, people don't recognize that could be my son, that could be my brother, that could be my friend, that could be my family member. You lose your political coalition power. And in fact, you could trigger a white backlash. And I guarantee you that's coming. Because that's what happened after 1967 and 1968 when things got out of hand with riots too. And once King and X were dead and you couldn't have peaceable protest anymore, it became a problem. People tell me you can't do peaceable protest. I tell them just go back to look to Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. They did hundreds and hundreds of protests all across the country in much worse conditions, with police sending dogs to bite their little children. And yet they didn't let one protest get out of hand. That's because it was rooted in the Black religious community, Evangelical Protestant Church for MLK, Nation of Islam for Malcolm X, also the Black business community, also civil rights lawyers and academics and others. BLM has none of those roots, doesn't even like Black churches, is against Black businesses because it thinks this is all part of the oppressive regime and you're just an Uncle Tom if you have a Black business. This is why what's happening is happening. BLM has a very distinct ideological perspective that is not rooted in the civil rights movement. It is rooted in sort of communist popular front methodology of the 1920s, 1930s, where you use a controversy to build divisiveness to create revolutionary insurrection to change the power equation. That's why there's no concrete policy agenda from BLM. Their only concrete proposal that they have ever announced is to defund the police, which is not a serious proposal.
I mean, I don't even understand that if it's a serious... what happens? Defund the police. What happens? I mean, I don't even understand what would be the next step. Defund the police.
Exactly. This is what happens when your 10-year-old comes up with a very bad idea that he thinks is really genius. You know, they're like, hey, I got it. And you're like, that doesn't work past step one. It's also the sign of low IQ criminals, the ones that get caught. They always say criminals have low IQ. No, it's only the caught criminals that have low IQ because that's who they're testing. And I call them one-step thinkers. The people who are like, oh, look at that purse. I'm going to steal that purse. They don't think, oh, how do I not get caught after I steal the purse? They're just not two-step thinkers. And a lot of your BLM activists, one-step thinkers. Now, in part, that's because their goal is to, like, they're very anti the United States in general. They're very, like, for example, BLM spends more time on illegal immigration issues than they do on Black employment issues. That doesn't make any sense at all. That's where, like, well, sometimes this comparison is misdone when people say, why doesn't Black Lives Matter care about gang violence, like in Chicago? And they're just pointing out, like, if every Black life matters, the number one threat to Black lives is Black on Black violent crime because of the drug trade and gang activity. And some people would blame guns. I would not. But, you know, if you want to, you can go down that route too. But by far, there's an average African American man in the United States last year was more likely to die from a hornet, bee, or wasp than he was as an unarmed man from a white police officer. So it's not like they're going to hold anti-wasp riots tomorrow, unless it's a South Park episode. So the nature and the dynamic of it is such that they've known this, but they've taken the path that they've taken because they don't really want policy reform. And that's also why I think they deliberately elevate bad cases. They actually want to play into white stereotypes. They want to enhance those white stereotypes because that creates further divisiveness, further anger, further racial bias. That's why they wouldn't touch. I mean, I got educated this the hard way. I had some suspicion about them because of my own connection to civil rights groups and noting that they were not connected to who really made civil rights strong and effective in the country historically. But when I would go to BLM groups and say, look, I got this case. This is a great case. We can help bring meaningful reform. I can get the whole jail system to totally change. I can use it as a predicate to get a whole bunch of jails across the whole nation to change because I can say, I'm going to come find your case and I'm going to sue in the same way unless you do this. I've done this in other cases. Have got the cities and counties across the entire state to change and across the entire country in certain cases to change the whole way they do business. BLM wouldn't touch my cases with a 100-foot pole. And that's when I realized, okay, this group is not about actual civil rights reform. I mean, there's lots of great studies out there about how easy it is to reform police departments. And to be in defense of police, we've had some of the lowest rates of police on unarmed violence actually last year that we've had in 20 years. So there's actually been improvements. A lot of the publicity about this has improved things. But all you got to do, number one, get rid of bad cops. Bad cops are 80% of your police problems because either they do it or they bring other people in, like these other two guys that got prosecuted here. They have a habit and history of bringing other people in who just don't know how to handle the situation and do it. Get rid of your bad cops. You'll get rid of 80% of your problem. The rest of the 20% of your problem, and they have ways to screen for them, ways to identify them, and ways to kick them out quickly. Now, of course, that was going to implicate every prominent Democratic mayor or attorney general or prosecutor in the country. And that's going to impact most of the senators and governors in the country because they've held that office at one time or another. Just take a look at where Senator Harris got her power in California, the leading candidate to be the vice president of the United States. And because it's senile Joe, that means the actual president of the United States if they were to win. So that's why they don't want to go down that route politically. But that would actually fundamentally, radically reform police departments. The second component is incorporating medical and mental health into not only the training, but incorporating those personnel. We're putting too much pressure on police. Police cannot be social worker, shrink, doctor, nurse, and investigator and law enforcer. We cannot ask them to be all six. It's unfair. It's unconscionable. Third, we should improve the pay. We can make sure the quality of people that go into the police is higher if we pay them a reasonable amount out of the gate. When we pay them less than a truck driver makes, we're not encouraging the best people to take over those positions of incredible power and responsibility that ultimately can save lives and protect property. They'll, just from an economic investment perspective, they'll always be worth it. They'll always pay off 2x, 3x, 4x the rate of investment you make in them. As they improve quality, they save lives and they save property, which saves money as well. Fourth, the demilitarize. Every time they militarize these police departments, they go nuts. You start giving them tanks and you start giving them M16s and you start giving them crazy guns and crazy weapons, they're too tempted to do it. I remember there was a little town near my hometown, Red Bank, tiny little town. I take pot shots at them anytime I can, just because of a long history with them. But they formed their own little SWAT team. I was like, you got 3,000 people in your little tiny blue collar part of the whole city of Chattanooga. And I get you got to carve it out 100 years ago. You don't need your own SWAT team. And of course, what happened? That SWAT team started doing dumb stuff because they're looking for an excuse to get out there and do stuff. They want to be like the movie SWAT. There's like 8 SWAT movies, SWAT 2, SWAT 3. So they're going out there to do it. Then they shoot up the wrong house, shoot up someone else. And they realize, then they get sued. They're like, maybe we shouldn't have had that. Now that we got to write a 7, our whole city budget's going to go to the SWAT team's last year's screw up. So demilitarize the police. And that will also real citizen commission involvement. not a bunch of political actors, not some Kerner Commission nonsense, not a bunch of, not a 9/11 commission, not a bunch of political actors there to cover up stuff. Ordinary, everyday people like me, civil rights lawyers, civil rights activists, civil rights people, independent members of the community, not just elite people. Put some Black African-American ministers, African-American business leaders. They have a very common sense perspective of how to fix these things. They're both the victim of police abuse and crime, so they know how to bring the balance to the equation. And you do those things, 90 to 95% of your police abuse problem disappears. Can't cure it, can't fix it entirely. It's not, some people are going to slip through the cracks. Some people are going to slip up. Some people are going to lose it on a given day. A few bad apples are going to get in there to do the thing the first time. But you can clear up and clean up the rest. BLM doesn't want to talk about that. They want to have 3-word things that you just say over and over again. Black Lives Matter, defund the police. That sound almost robotic and automaton-like, because they don't want real reform. They want to use this to indict the United States of America, to condemn the country as a country, condemn the institutions as an institutions, and do things like defund the police, not replace the police, because that would be a different thing. That'd be, let's replace the police with a whole different way of policing the community. That's not what they're saying. They're saying just defund the police. The mayor of LA had that ingenious imbecile came up with he had all these crazy pandemic notions, told my friends and folks in LA that they could not even go to their business, couldn't even go outside and gather more than 10. And then he's saying, oh, but you can go all and riot and loot. But after that, he decided he was right on the BLM agenda, decided to go out there and kneel in front of all of them, like a bad Superman movie, where, Zorro says, you must kneel. And the guy kneels. He's like, you can't be the president. Nobody would kneel like that. Well, the mayor of LA did. And then he said he's going to do a 10 to 15% cut across the board of LA police. Now, LA police have a long, notorious history of some questionable activities. But that's a whole nother story, going back to James Ellroy's days. But he's going to get rid of the gang enforcement. LA has the worst gangs in the country. It's the center of MS-13. They operate it's not the Bloods and the Crips that are the big problem in LA. It's MS-13, the Central American gangs that now run MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center, federal prison downtown. I know that because my clients have to deal with them when they're inside. So that's a terrible idea. But hey, it's a brave new world after all.
Okay, amazing. I'm gonna get through these as many as I can. The super chats. What's the likelihood of the other police officers in the area being convicted? We talked about that earlier, but thank you very much. Wesley Gould, would the participation of politicians in protests be grounds for an anti-lockdown 14th Amendment claim regarding other First Amendment activities? Separate discussion. We'll get to it. It certainly undermines the arguments for what has been forced down the throats of a lot of people for the last little while.
It's too bad that Supreme Court case wasn't a couple of weeks later. I've been trying to tell some people, be careful about timing. I originally was very proactive because I wanted to be the first up to the Supreme Court. All the governors and politicians always change their policies to take out the emergency injunctive relief request I had. So in Chattanooga, it was, hey, I want to be able to have my client go to drive-in religious services. They change right away so I don't get to have an emergency injunction request on that. Michigan, I wanted my client to be able to travel between homes and businesses. The one thing the governor changes is the one thing that I'd sued her over to get emergency injunctive relief. I have other claims pending, but none that are emergency injunction relief. Same in a case I brought in Nevada. Same in a case in Maine. They brought back a bunch of things that we're trying to negotiate. They kept conceding all the time, unfortunately. So because if that decision, I think, is decided next week, Roberts looks like an idiot. Pretending that they weren't discriminating against the church. Aside from that, he knew he was being intellectually dishonest about that. But he looks more like an idiot because he's like these careful politicians who are just making these hard choices in the middle of this very difficult pandemic. When they did all of this nonsense, they were
handing out face masks at protests. I mean, it's inconceivable, and it's just mutually incompatible, incongruent to maintain both positions at the same time. I'm not sucking and blowing either. I'm not saying that. I'm not just calling them hypocrites. I'm saying the lockdown measures were excessive.
Of course, it was always garbage. It was always nonsense. What's fascinating is some poor sap in the PR department sent out a notice from one of the cities saying, "Here's the current lockdown rules." And number one and number two contradict each other. It says if you're outside social gatherings, no more than 10 people. Outside protests can be more than 100. It's like, oh, I'll do a party outdoors. I'll just call it a BLM party protest. and I can invite whomever I want. I can go to church now with 100+ people. I just called a BLM church gathering.
That was one of the jokes is don't go to church to pray, just go to church to riot and you'll be fine, or go to church to pray, you'll be fine.
Yes.
To help Barnes buy a nicer camera, I think it's just
it's the nature of this
the built-in cams. Uncivil Law says abolish QI. What is QI?
Qualified immunity. So I agree with that. I do agree that qualified immunity shouldn't exist. It's all based on this myth of sovereign immunity that goes back to the king can do no wrong. The idea of the whole concept of sovereign immunity is that you couldn't sue the king because the king was God, and by definition, whatever the king did could not be wrong because he was God. The sovereign immunity is not written into the Constitution. It's not written, well, for the most part, it's not written into any statute. There's some statutes that establish immunity, which I also have a problem with. How can politicians immunize themselves? We hereby declare we can never be sued for anything bad we do. That strikes me as inherently a constitutional conflict, which I'll actually be arguing in part next week in the Okay. That's going to be next Thursday in front of the Sixth Circuit via Zoom, which is going to be totally weird.
Can the general public tune in to watch live?
I don't think so. In fact, I don't even think I'm allowed to record it, but I think they will release an audio of it within an hour of it occurring.
Okay, so maybe I'll have to get on that. We'll be in touch about that. So Ryan Acorn says, where do you find an army of mental health professionals who are willing to go out unarmed and deal with people at their absolute worst? Well, where the flip side is you have policemen who are armed going out and doing this as opposed to having people.
Exactly. And actually, there's a lot of people who like that work. So there's a lot of RNs, nursing has been a growing profession. There's a lot of people that would love that crisis situation. I'm going to go in, I'm going to help save the day, I'm going to help deal with this person. In my experience, there's a lot of people I know in the medical profession that actually would seek that out, much more than cops. There's a lot of cops that would love to not have to deal with the drug addict guy and be lead on it. They would rather someone else be lead on it. The ones that do it day to day are that. The power freaks are different, putting aside the power freaks.
Let me just see. I'll get this one before I ask my question. Life of Brian, what about bad cop culture normalizes corruption and violence? Serpico claims it's worse now.
No question. And that's what I meant, that you have a percentage of cops that are bad, and some of them are bad because of corruption. Some of them are bad because they're sociopaths who like to act out their sociopathological fantasies. And you can just sort of imagine that by nature, right? So it's my theory of the Klan. It's my theory of Antifa. It's my theory of Islamic terrorism. Most of the time, the people doing the worst behavior were already sociopaths. And somebody just comes along and says, hey, I'm going to give you a political and moral excuse to do that sick sociopathic fantasy you had in your head. And they're like, sociopaths, like, oh, okay. And that's where you dig into the Klan. Racism as an ideology didn't really explain their behavior. Because they had dysfunctional families, domestic violence, all kinds of abuse, long criminal histories, and at least 80% of active violent Klansmen. You'll probably find the same with Antifa. There's a reason why Islamic terrorists recruit in prisons. It's not just because it's a convenient place to recruit. It's because they're looking for sociopaths, and they're saying, hey, you know what? Actually, Allah wants you to be a sociopath. That's really the pitch. And so that's really that's what Antifa is to a large extent. And it's what cops are. So you're going to have a percentage of, if you're a sociopath, where do you go to work? It's like I tell people, not all clowns are bad, but your sicko perverts are going to want to be clowns. Just saying. I mean, that's, I have a little bit dismissive attitude towards clowns, because who really wants to dress up and look that way? That's all I'm saying. But putting that aside, but you're going to find your weirdos, and your sociopaths. Here, I'm going to give you a badge. I always think of the South Park episode with Cartman, and he's going around beating everybody when he's a policeman, saying "respect my authority." There's a percentage of cops that want that. I've dealt with them personally. I've been in probably 4 situations where that's occurred. Like, I, more than some of my African American friends, have dealt with more difficult police than they have, and that's why I always tell them. These guys don't discriminate. They want power. The only time they'll discriminate is when they think it'll be easier to get away with their abuse of power based on your race, based on your economic status, based on your religion, based on your immigration status, et cetera. But mostly what they are is they're just looking to act on that sociopathology. And that's why they don't reform. Like, some of these nitwits will say, oh, we can just retrain them. We can just say, bad, don't do that again. No. These people are sociopaths. They don't fix this. You got to kick them out, not rehire them, finish with them. One of the earlier questions, yes, police unions are a problem in this regard. Police unions put in their contract certain protections that go beyond what's necessary. I've never been a big fan of government unions. I'm a big fan of unions. I like unions. I come from a union subculture, not government unions. That combination is not a healthy combination.
Okay, very interesting. And we're going to do this one. Not going to be much of a comment to this one, but I made this point yesterday. How can Democrats argue for mail-in votes, for CV safety but allow protests? I think the world has seen that. So we'll see where the argument goes now that we've seen what we've seen. And apparently there was only one case that came out of the Ozarks pool party, one case of COVID. Tony Timpa, I just want to deal with it briefly because so someone emailed me the video this morning. I watched it. It's another upsetting video. And so what are a lot of the factual pattern is similar. If anybody hasn't seen the video, go watch it. I mean, people asking what's the difference. Watching the two videos, I get a much different impression from the cops involved. I don't know if you've seen both videos. I get a different impression from the cops involved in that some seem absolutely incompetent versus in George absolutely malicious. Mm-hmm. But the biggest difference in my mind is that, and I don't understand how it happens, is that when Tony Timpa appears to be unconscious, a medic comes in and injects him with a sedative. And I mean, I didn't see the autopsy in that case, and I don't know if the sedative injected into this guy who already seems to be unconscious or semi-conscious wouldn't just put him over the edge and stop his breathing altogether. So there was that major difference, is that in George Floyd, nobody administered a sedative that we know of when he was already unconscious. In Tony Timpa, they did. Above and beyond that, I just, the demeanor of the cops struck me as radically different. In Tony Timpa, they didn't look malicious. They just looked absolutely incompetent, versus in George Floyd, absolutely malicious, from Chauvin to the guy standing guard for him. What do you say? I mean, what do you think?
No, I think that's a very good assessment. And I think the other thing is I have a little concern with paramedics that work too often with police, so that there can be a too friendly relationship sometimes, and that can be an issue if like some police departments institutionalize a relationship with certain subgroups of paramedics. And the problem is then you have buddy culture, so on and so forth.
In Tony Timpa, medic comes, injects him with Verse. I had to Google Verse to find out some sort of methadoxil, whatever. And it has, in its ordinary course of things, it leads to respiratory failure. So that was the biggest difference. Anybody comparing the two, you have to be aware that a medic came and injected unconscious Tony Timpa with a sedative. Yep. Timothy Scover, thank you very much. Tails DM, trying to have civil and detailed talks like this are becoming hard to have. People want to go to slogans. How do we have the tough conversations? I agree. I mean, and people don't understand this. Like, yesterday I criticized. I expressed my disagreement with Candace Owens' most recent tweet in her video about deifying George Floyd. And I said, right. She may have a legitimate point, but there's a time and a place for every point. And I don't think the time and the place for that discussion, because it's not the first time she's made that argument. I followed her for a long time. I know her points. It's a legitimate point. I don't think you make it in the backdrop of this tragedy is my only.
No, and I agree with that. And I think what I've told people is never, what I think has created that in part, her reaction is because BLM deliberately tries to make everybody an angel. And when especially they like to make people angels who are the least likely candidates to be so. Yeah. But my view is the response to that is not to get caught in that trap. That's why I always said on the Arbery side, it was a bad idea to push that story because it's probably not going to be true. You ignore that. The question is whether these guys had a reasonable suspicion, or do we really want, as part of the moral narrative, guys like this deciding that they're cops when they're not. So, I mean, that's sort of the broader script, and stick to that script. You don't have to get into the other stuff.
Well, Candace Owen has been making this point for a long time that the community needs proper role models and not the bad.
And I think there's a balance there. I mean, Malcolm X was the best at that because he was so assertive both ways. He was not bashful. And like I have a certain immunity about a lot of these conversations because if people take a shot at me, I'm like, look, I've been doing civil rights work for 20 years. When whoever's taking a shot at me, I say, unless you've been doing the same, bye-bye, and you can stay quiet. I don't allow that conversational, that your skin tone should dictate who gets to talk, all that garbage. That's all nonsense to me. So I treat it as such. A kid screaming at you is no reason to have the kid dictate the rules of the conversation to you. And I find often that some people will just scream more, but a lot of them will back down. And the reasonable ones, and those are the only ones you're trying to reach, will second guess what they're doing and thinking. Say, hold on a second, is that who I want to be? Like both my son and my daughter participated in various protests. Told my son not to go. He went anyway, God bless him. Because
he didn't pull a Jake Paul or anything.
No, praise God. He's a smart kid. But he's into that whole subculture. He grew up in the rap subculture. He relates to rappers dying because they're sort of personal icons. So to him, that whole culture, it was a sign that you care about me to go out there. My brother-in-law is African American, also wanted to go out. And I was just like, look, these things are getting infiltrated. They're being infiltrated by criminal underworld units who are staging crime under the guise of being protest. It's being infiltrated by Antifa, who wants violent insurrection as their modus operandi. And I don't trust BLM, period, in terms of how they're organizing these things. And it said it easily can get out of hand one way or the other. They're trying to trigger the police into overreacting. It's already happened in some places. I said the chances this goes sideways is long and hard, and there's a lot of ways to support civil rights independent of talking on a TV or talking to Instagram. But God bless him, he did it. He apologized later. He told me first he didn't go, and then he sent me, hey, yeah, I told you, by the way, maybe I went probably fearing maybe I'd see him on TV, be like, hey, what are you doing? And my daughter did the same, and I understand that. And she's in the modeling industry, so like she should do it, kind of, politically speaking. Got to do the black square and all that jazz. But my response to all those people is, put your money where your mouth is. Otherwise, you don't get to lecture me about any of this. You can disagree with me. God, absolutely, have at it. But you don't get to tell me I don't get to speak or that your opinion has more authority than mine when 99% of the people talking to me have never done the cases I have or contributed or be involved with them. I have real problems with LeBron James and some of these other people. LeBron James just yips. When I see him get active in a civil rights case in his hometown in Akron, then I'll take him seriously. Until then, he's just a celebrity trying to sell some shoes.
Okay. And Zachariah Kitzman says, wouldn't revoking qualified immunity, I think it means bring down officers in frivolous lawsuits?
Don't got to worry about that, my friend. It is hard enough to win really good, strong, clean cases. I mean, I have cases that the government's not settling where 8.5-month pregnant, 2 different cases, 8.5-month pregnant women were stuck in isolation. They were on drugs and had drug issues, according to the arrest record. They knew that they were near term, could give birth at any moment, did no monitoring of them all night, woke up with a dead baby in their arms. In one case, they tried to pretend the baby died at the hospital by the way they doctored the records. Now, that's a case you would think, wow, horrific mistake. We recognize it. We got to change the way we treat pregnant women in jail and in custody. And hey, let's sit down and see how we can develop policies that reform things and get monies to the mothers who suffered these horrific events to try to restore and put their lives back together. Nope, not doing that at all. Why? Because they know now, especially with all the rioting and looting going on, that they're going to have a 50-50 chance at least of jurors who will never give a penny or a nickel or a dime or dollar or hold a cop to any level of responsibility because there's such a backlash against what's happened. So I know the concern, hey, they'll be frivolous. And in some big cities, liberal democratic environments, there might be a risk of that. That is not a common risk. It's like medical, when doctors say, we have to worry about we had to have caps on medical malpractice cases. I was like, 90% of medical malpractice, according to the doctor's own survey, never even result in a suit. Of the 10% that do, the doctors win 83% of the time at trial. It's like you guys are not facing an epidemic of lawsuits. People see a doctor or they see a cop. With all of this, their tendency is going to be to say that person did right. That's why you'll see in the polls. They'll say, hey, how do you feel about your local police? They may say a whole bunch of bad stuff about police in general, negative police in the poll. But when they ask them about their local police, over 80% consistently say they're doing a great job. So nobody wants to hold a cop responsible. It doesn't look that way in light of these cases, but that's because these cases are disconnected from a local community and have been politicized in a particular way. In the everyday case, most jurors, your average juror is a 60-year-old white guy. So because everybody else finds a way to try to get out of it, and God bless it, African Americans talk their way out of juries all the time now. They want to brag to the judge about how deeply they're involved in caring about BLM related issues, which of course guarantees their exclusion from the trial. Drives me insane. I'm like, can't somebody learn to? Nope, they can't. And so the frivolous lawsuits is not a concern. There's a lot of play. I understand people saying, "Hey, we don't want to make it easier to sue cops." Trust me, it's not exactly easy now. It's nowhere.
Well, I'm not even sure I might agree with that. I might want to make it easier to sue cops because it might make them a little bit more apprehensive.
Higher responsibility. And my view is the way we should commensurate for that is we should pay them better. So we are going to hold them to a higher level of responsibility. But honestly, they do better work than most lawyers. I have an unusual view on that. I don't think that we should have a monopoly on the legal profession in the world, in the country. But my view is cops do better, more important. Well, put it this way, more important work than what an average lawyer is doing. And we both know a lot of average lawyers. Say average is generous. So let's put it that way. Yeah. I mean, they're not as bad a lawyer as Legal Eagle is, but there's some others.
Oh boy, now we're gonna get some. I hope we don't get the Legal fans trolling and calling us names now. I'm gonna blast through these super chats. The verse might be to facilitate intubation. Yeah, I don't know the full circumstance. That detail struck me. JP Boudreau says thoughts on third-party branch organizations to specifically investigate police killings and brutality.
I prefer civilian commissions. Civilian commissions have achieved that very successfully if the right people are put on those commissions.
Okay, let's see. I know I missed two right here. Dapper Dave says Robert's thoughts on the police response to the protesters. If it is unknown who in the crowd is throwing bricks at them and the crowd is not saying who they are, what can they do other than responding with rubber bullets and pepper and spray?
That's their goal. Now, I will say I was watching Vice, and Vice did a coverage of what happened in Minneapolis. And what was fascinating is they happened to catch people so the protest was happening. A group of 8 branch off and rob a Wells Fargo, and they had all the equipment to rob the ATMs. When I saw that told me 2 things. One, that criminal gangs are part of this. But secondly, those criminal gangs knew what the map was of the protest. And that was not public knowledge to my understanding, which means at some level they're coordinating with the people that are the head of the march. Now, maybe the head protesters have no idea. I honestly don't accept that because I've organized protests. I was organizing protests when I was a kid in high school. Got in trouble for it, but I was organizing for a long time. So the idea that they had no clue that there are criminal groups, but that's their goal. And that's Antifa's goal too. So the goal is what's unique here is you not only have Antifa, but you have criminal underworld elements that are part of this. And they can dress like Antifa as well. And now because it's all COVID-19, everybody gets to wear masks. It's still insane to me. They're blending in. They know the routes. And Antifa goes and does selective violence. And they need Antifa to do some of the violence because it helps distract the police so they can go off and do the crimes. And they want the police distracted. And what Antifa wants is to be able to trigger a police reaction like we had in Buffalo, where they pushed that old guy down. And I get people are mad at the cop. But the old guy is also, the old guy is going to be an old school protester. And as an old school protester, he's going to be someone who is familiar with walking up to the cop and trying to do what he was doing was going to trigger a response. Now, they still shouldn't have pushed him in the way he did. But because he's old, fragile, that guy could fall down walking around normally. So given those circumstances, but that's what they want. They see V for Vendetta as a different kind of script. I always liked the movie, but for them, they say, commit certain kinds of violence that will trigger the police into an even worse act of violence. And then the whole system comes tumbling down. And by the way, these people really believe the revolution is going to happen tomorrow. They think insurrectionary change takes place fast. From a global historical perspective, they'd be right. But from a recent historical perspective in the US, they'd be wrong. But they really think if they keep escalating, the whole world will change. And we'll have anarcho-communism in Portland in a month.
Okay. It's interesting. Okay, is it true that more cops have been killed by protesters, rioters in this week than unarmed black men have been killed by police in 2019?
I don't know about cops yet. I know that over almost 400 cops have gone to the ICU already. So 10 unarmed African Americans were killed by white cops in 2019. 8 of those were found to be justified. My own personal view in looking at those cases, I think 6 were justified. I'm not believing the other 2. But you have a lot of cop stories where you don't have independent evidence. It's tough to prove. Breonna Taylor is a case where they clearly, I think, engaged in misconduct. I have a case in California where these idiots in the city of Fontana just raided the wrong house, terrified a young girl that was in the house. long after they should have known. I mean, their own description was that no little girl would be in the house. I mean, so at some point you figure out, oh, golly gee, I'm in the wrong house. They're telling me I'm in the wrong house. People are in the house when we scoped it out, we weren't here. Obviously, we looked at we were looking at we went into the wrong place compared to where we scoped out. So you have cops that are bad, but in that context, it will probably end up that way. Now, it depends if you include retired cops, security guards, things like that. The total number innocent, unarmed people killed by the end of the riots will be probably more than all of the unarmed. There are only, I think, 30 or so unarmed people. Maybe it was 40, close to 40 unarmed people killed in all of 2019 by police. And in some of those cases, they were unarmed, but they tried to get armed. In other words, they can't, the things like that.
Okay, amazing. And Lord Rawls says members of the military are held to a higher standard and are subject to both civilian law and UCMJ. What are your thoughts on establishing additional laws for police in a similar fashion?
I think it's a good. I mean, I do agree with the idea that we should take excessive force from the civil world and make it a criminal. Right now, they sort of practically do. So, like the way they're going to prosecute the George Floyd case, they're going to treat the failure to the engagement of excessive force as a form of felony, probably either false imprisonment or assault. But my view is they could easily criminalize excessive force, and I would support that because that would put a lot of cops on individual notice. Because right now, if they screw up, the city writes the check. That's the other thing. They don't talk about cops writing checks. No cop who gets sued ever writes a check. The insurance company for the city or the state writes the check.
Well, I seem to have missed one chat from Jason McConnell. Who knew roasted eagle smelled like chicken? Okay.
Oh, you did. I don't know if you saw his Flynn thing. He falsely accused Flynn of treason, and he also said the judge had complete discretion in refusing a motion to dismiss.
Perfect.
Now, I knew the guy was a nitwit.
Let's get into it. Perfect segue. And before my wife comes in with the kids, Robert. Okay, I don't know if you saw my video. I
did.
Okay, so am I out in left field on any?
No, that's totally right. And I knew at the time the hearing was going on, the judge was trapping him. I was in conversation with some of Flynn's people. I won't get into detail as to how or why, but I said there were serious concerns about the judge after that hearing, watching what took place. Publicly, I said something different. Privately, I said that because at the time there was a chance I was going to represent him at any future proceedings. But it was clear by that point that the judge had a bias against him. Two things were revealed that day. One, the judge clearly was tracking the media's coverage because he made that ridiculous comment about treason. Then he takes a break, but he only goes into chambers. And somehow when he comes back out, he knows that right away to volunteer information about treason. He could only know that because he and his staff were obsessively following Twitter and social media about what he said.
And people are saying, you're an idiot. What are you talking about? We're not at war, and this couldn't possibly be.
Okay. I mean, can you imagine a judge being that long on the bench and being that dumb? That's Sullivan. Dumb as a bale of bricks, not bright.
Okay, now so the one thing I think I knew might be standard protocol in the practice that I'm just not familiar with, when they get someone who's pleading guilty, when they get to someone who's pleading guilty, and they get them to you acknowledge you're pleading guilty to a crime, you're telling the truth, the being satisfied with the services of your attorneys, is that a standard thing to get someone who's pleading to on the record agree to?
The entire thing is a trap to prevent them from being able to set aside the plea for any constitutional reason later. That's what the colloquy is about. So I'll give you my story. Very first time I ever did it, young lawyer, kid lawyer, LA, had a client who really was coerced to plea because of threats to his family to prosecute them. But you're not supposed to talk about any of that, not supposed to say any of that. And the rest. So I get up there. I hadn't been through a plea colloquy. It's my first plea colloquy. And the judge starts going through some stuff, and I'm thinking, okay. And then my client gets agitated. He's like, that's not really true. And I take him out and I say, here's the reality. Unless you say that, the judge won't take the plea. Then you won't get the benefit of the deal. You're better off just saying that, even if it isn't quite true. I'll throw in some phrases to make it clear for the record. But then the judge demanded, he took it a step further than Sullivan. He demanded, I agree that my client was guilty. And I actually did believe my client was guilty of the crime he had confessed to. It was his best deal. It was his best situation given the circumstances. But I got agitated, at which point the judge got very agitated at me. I was like, do I really need to answer that? And then went along with it because I realized what's in my client's best interest. But I realized what a scam the whole thing is. So everything about a plea colloquy is a scam, in my view. It's not meaningfully meant to get to the true answer. It's meant to say, let's trap you so that you can never challenge this plea again in the future. Asking questions you can't even meaningfully answer at the time.
Well, so that's the other thing. Is like he's asking Flynn to recognize that he is aware of the investigation of FBI misconduct.
Yes.
Okay. He acknowledges that. Depending on the outcome of that, like you can't possibly acquiesce or abandon your future rights, not knowing what the outcome of that is going to be. And unless the judge knows, or unless other people know how bad it goes, which is why they're pressing so hard, so repeatedly under oath to confirm under penalty of prosecution for perjury that you're entering this plea, notwithstanding knowledge of a FBI misconduct inquiry, it seems extortive, but I don't know if it's just industry standard.
It's absolute. I always said that all we did is we took the Inquisition and we put a nice fancy phrase on it. And we made everybody feel better about it in the dresses that we wear. But in the end, it is just the Inquisition. You take a duck to the prom, a duck is still a duck. So the old Southern saying, they may have substituted other animals in there, but I'm keeping it kosher. So it's the same nature of it. There's a reason why our system loves confession. And pleas are their favorite form of confession. And it's all about bowing to the king. And it's the same thing that's happening in the streets right now. Submit. Show your shame. Show your humiliation. Show your embarrassment to be who you are. It's that Game of Thrones shame walk kind of thing where the queen has to walk through. So it's that same kind of mindset and mentality. And it's what I hate about it is it's so coercive. It's so punitive. It's so vicious. It's so vindictive. So even when I had clients there was only one client I really, really, really did not like. People can figure that out themselves if they Google certain conversations. But even in that client's case, I hated how mean and vicious the judiciary was and how mean and vicious the whole criminal justice system was. It's the part that's really distorted. And I've tried to soften up some of the lefty types and some of the more pragmatic types to say this system is a barbaric system down deep. And does not really reflect our humane values. But it's the nature of it. And because it's the core to power, our systems of justice are simply about reinforcing power. I always tell people, if you want an honest version of our criminal justice system, just go to Mad Max and Beyond Thunderdome. It's a roll of the dice. It's a spin of the wheel. Yes, indeed it is.
Okay, now I missed the super chat, but SSG Lesser said, what are your suggestions and or advice for a pro se senior such as myself? That it has to be a topic for another day. I did a video about self-representation. I take it for what it's worth, but that would be unfortunately a totally separate discussion, which it might be a very interesting one to have. But so Flynn, so the judge knows there's an FBI misconduct investigation. He says, Flynn, you're pleading guilty. You know that you're never going to come back. You're factoring that in. I'm going to delay your sentencing pending your cooperation with the government as a witness in this Rafikian trial, which is the only reason why Sullivan did not sentence Flynn the day of. It says we want to make sure you cooperate after you've renounced all of these things, renounced the rights that you have that have not yet been born. Cooperate, and then maybe, I can't promise it, but maybe I'll reduce your sentence. And then he gets into, discussing treason and all this other stuff.
Yes.
What's the deal there? I don't think anybody knew that Flynn was also, in addition to the threats to his son, was being coerced into testifying in a separate file, in consideration of which he might get a reduced sentence. Do you know the detail of that?
The real backstory is both the defense and the government was shocked by the judge's behavior that day. The government thought, hey, we've got a nice clean rap. Flynn's never going to discover all this bad stuff we did. We got him to plead guilty. We'll be done. We'll be finished. That's the government's goal. Flynn's side has told him, you're going to get a straight up probationary sentence. No biggie. Government's recommended it. You're out there. As soon as both sides realized, oh, it's crazy Judge Sullivan Day, and he has one of those at least a month, according to people I've talked to that know him, they realized, okay, how do we get him out of this so he doesn't sentence today? The government doesn't want Flynn to say anything about walking back the plea. The defense doesn't want the government to move forward with sentencing. So they went outside during the break, and this is my guess. I don't have personal information on this, but is that they talked to each other. It's what I would have done, and said, hey, let's convince the judge that you really need Flynn for this next case. That way we'll get crazy Sullivan to back off and we'll figure something out down the road. They never planned on using Flynn for that other case. They never needed it.
I see. Their concern, from what you're describing, their concern is that Sullivan would not have accepted the plea bargain and let Flynn go free. He would have actually sentenced Flynn to jail time, notwithstanding the plea bargain, which would have pissed everybody off and might have caused Flynn to walk back on his guilty plea.
Exactly.
Okay, fascinating. Just going to bring this on up. Is Legal Eagle the person who thinks the Flynn prosecution is legit? On topic, police should take this weekend off and let the people see the future. Okay, so then Sullivan then says, above and beyond all this, I'm not going to hide my disdain, my disgust for the crime that you committed. Is that standard? I mean,
no.
Is it?
So this was one. He showed how thrilled he was to get media coverage. 2, he revealed how much he was following that media coverage in live time. And 3, he disclosed not only his complete lack of knowledge about the law, that he had bought into every crazy cookie conspiracy theory version of what Flynn had done, and didn't know basic legal provisions, but that he was very biased against Flynn. And so, and to his credit, he at least let Flynn know that, right? Flynn may have never walked back his plea, but for Sullivan saying, by the way, I'm crazy Judge Sullivan today. And so I'll give Sullivan credit in that sense. But that is extraordinary. Like the Roger Stone judge, she would have hinted none of that. She would have made it sound like, oh, I think you've been very fair. Make sure everything's good. And I want to would have done the same bogus colloquy, but even a little more coercive. Would have done no negative rhetoric, would have done no demand he participate in another proceeding, because that can be used against him in that other trial if he was actually a key witness in that trial. And would have made it sound like she was going to go soft on him so that he would be surprised when the knife came in. Sullivan was the opposite way, because he's such a grandstander and natural. He's a natural talk first, think second guy.
Okay, now I'm going to bring up these super chats. Before, the question I want was judicial authority to ask their own questions of their own volition. I'm going to get to that right after these, and then we're Dapper Dave. Robert, you said your friend gets his cases recused in Texans. Can arguments be made for Sullivan to be recused on future cases based on this conduct?
Very hard. I mean, the case in California against, that's the Manny Real case. He flipped him off. He took a big risk there. But Manny Real was equally crazy, and so that's how that worked. As a whole, it's very hard to get federal judges recused in any circumstance. So outside of it, now there was a case in Milwaukee I had, early civil rights case. My guy photographed some corrupt cops. They beat him up. The judge helped fix the case, give me a crazy jury, literally cussed at me on the record for bringing up misconduct of police officers on the record to the public, with the press watching. He sat there and literally cussed at me for 10 minutes straight. And what turned out good for that is he ended up being assigned to a case I had. He was on a special assignment from Indiana to handle the case in Milwaukee. He ended up being assigned to my case in Milwaukee, and I was like, "You're nuts. You're off. I already filed a complaint against you." And luckily, that ended up being very beneficial to my client. But outside of those circumstances, very hard to get a judge removed from a case.
Okay, interesting. Now, don't say anything, Robert. I'm just going to read the comment. Please say you know for a fact that you know Legal Eagle is, and that the SOB is an awful lawyer. Robert Barnes, and I believe he is biased. That is my method of describing it. Robert has expressed himself earlier.
Legal Eagle is an idiot. So there's no doubt. I mean, here it was. He was a corporate lawyer in D.C. for a couple of years. Then he started his own firm, though he's shown up on no case that I know of. It appears to me more the firm is for him to do his YouTube thing. But here's the big giveaway. Aside from the ridiculous Flynn committed treason allegation, when he said that a judge has complete discretion to deny a government's motion to dismiss, that's fake news. That's not real news. It's fake news.
I'm Canadian. I know the Supreme Court does. It was Seneningen. I can't pronounce it. Seneningen.
Well, the Seneningen is the amici case, and then there's the direct case, the Ninth Circuit, that even Sullivan admitted when he cited it, called U.S. Blanket on the last name, 2016.
Fokker, but there's Fokker in there as well, which is.
Yes, Fokker is the D.C. Circuit case that said no. And by the way, that's been established law for forever. The executive branch constitutionally controls prosecutions. This is a constitutionally rooted provision that the Federal Rule 48, Federal Criminal Procedure 48, simply codifies and reflects what the Constitution compels. We're not Europe. We do not have judges going around pretending to be prosecutors. This has been established for as long as our republic has existed. And the fact when he didn't know that, not only didn't know that, told people exactly the opposite. He couldn't take 5 seconds to research it. Legal Eagle gets his legal information from CNN. So
I'm happy that I found that when I'm looking into it, and I do minimal research online just to make sure I don't make a mistake. But it seemed black and white, and they said the exceptions under which the judge can exercise their discretion are exquisitely limited, and
only when they're trying to screw the defendant over.
Okay, Vicky Rosie says, Barnes, at some point, can you tell us, one, if you think Trump is still likely to win, will economy really rebound as quickly, easily per his speech today? Are the unemployment numbers legit?
The Shadow Stats is the site to go to see what real unemployment is. We're probably a little over 20% still. As to the economy, I do not think we'll have a V-shaped recovery. You can follow George Gammon also on YouTube. He's the Viva Fry of economics, provides information in an accessible, actionable way that you can digest without being an expert or have a degree to do so. I don't think our economy is going to bounce back real fast. I think we're in further trouble than people think. But the riots have probably saved Trump. If I was an anti-Trump guy, I would totally be into the conspiracy theory about the riots because it will politically rebound tremendously. I mean, we've seen this script before. In 1968, it helped get Richard Nixon elected with ease. I mean, people forget the only reason why Richard Nixon didn't win by a landslide in 1968 was because George Wallace got double-digit support. So, and including in places like Detroit, how did he get, and Milwaukee, and Philadelphia, and Newark, how did that happen? The riots. So the riots are going to lead to a massive backlash.
Okay. There's a comment on the riots. And any concern that if the rioters are given what they're asking for, they will only be incentivized for more riots or cause retaliatory riots. I would be skeptical if the rioters are going to get what they're asking for, because I mean they're asking for a lot of different things from a lot of decentralized points, and
only a few lefty cities are giving into this. It'll be interesting to watch. We've been through this experiment, and a lot of your neoliberal Republican types and lefty Democrats and mayors actually tried to give in to a lot of the rioting activities in 67 and 68. All it did was lead to more problematic behavior and then a political backlash in the rest of the country.
All right, next, Fryman, what's something you disagree with Barnes on? I disagreed with Barnes' original assessment in Arbery. His interpretation of the facts, interpretation of the law, I can't really disagree with, but that's the one that sticks out. And look at that, we're still friends. It's amazing. And
the facts ultimately end up supporting more your assumption about what took place, given that the racial bias clearly was a factor for at least several of them, according to the evidence so far.
I didn't suspect. I didn't go to racial bias. I just said this is not the way.
That something was wrong in their behavior. That their motivation was not reasonable suspicion of a crime.
Yeah, and as I took flack for my position from other people as well. But to Sir Barnes, the guy who cussed you out for 10 minutes, any chance we can get a minute order?
Now, it was not in writing, and that's the way these judges do it. They tell the transcript, the court reporter. They'll do this little wave thing, which means no more on the record. Oh, no. And that's when they do all the bogus stuff. And I've been subject to it multiple times. But I pushed back. It's a weird instinct, so like it's whatever it is. I had a situation. I was walking out with a client, U.S. Marshal, FBI agent, jumped me and my client, falsely accused me and my client of being involved in a conspiracy to kill a federal prosecutor, all these insane allegations. The whole goal being to destabilize my client's confidence in me, get me out of the case, and punish me for bringing civil rights cases related to him that exposed massive misconduct on the government's behalf in a wide range of contexts. My first response was to just start cussing at him and going right at him. Whatever it is, there's that quiz. They send people, you go into the woods and you come to a tree and you come to a house and you find a cup in the woods and you see a bear and you come to water, and it's all how you interpret it. It has these secret psychological meanings. Well, one of them is you come to a bear, and apparently what kind of bear, what size they are, how they're acting describes your perception of fear, your sense of fear. Well, when I did the quiz, I said I saw a koala bear that you could just go up and hug. So I had no idea. But whatever it is, it's not always healthy for people. That's what I tell my son. It's not always a good idea that I don't have this normal sense of fear in the world, but it has been useful on occasion in dealing with corrupt judges and prosecutors.
That's fantastic. Now, we smoke Bitcoin. Just got to read it. Attention peoples, buy Bitcoin.
Actually, that's a good idea right now. Things are getting crazy politically and legally. You should be jurisdictionally diversified. multiple forms of citizenship if you can, but even if you can't afford that, have some Bitcoin so you don't have to depend on the bank stability or any particular currency to be able to survive. If you have some Bitcoin, you can go someplace and get what you need to get by for at least some period of time. Okay,
very interesting. And I'm going to read through these two, then I'm going to ask you the question that I want to about Flynn. Can the lawfare against 2A rights be stopped by removing SI from legislators? What is the SI?
Statutory immunity or sovereign immunity.
Okay, statutory immunity, with the only defense being due diligence that their proposed law was constitutional prior to enactment.
I would love to do that, but what do you think the chances are legislators are going to take away their own immunity? So you'd have to do it by referendum if it's a state, and federally there's no other way to do but go through Congress. So I'm going to try to use whatever happens in the Covington case that I have oral arguments on next week, that if I don't win in the case, I'm going to use to get Congressman Massey and others to push for legislative change to take away Congress members' immunity and use that. So if they were smart, they would make sure Elizabeth Warren lost that case and I won in the Sixth Circuit. Because if not, I'm going to use it to take away all their immunities for everything if I can.
Okay, fascinating, by the way. Now, Martha, my dear, says, Fry and Barnes, love the conversation. Have a great day. Thank you very much. Barnes, this is Robert, this is my question now. Mm-hmm. The whole argument that, setting aside, I mean, people don't necessarily appreciate it. Sullivan was basically doing nothing more with that brief than giving all of the arguments that he wants Gleason to argue in front of him if it ever gets through. I'm not wrong about that, right?
That's absolutely the case.
Okay. And it drives me nuts. It's like, it's so deceitful. It's like, I'm not telling you that, but putting all the seeds in his head so that take that brief and argue it in front of me because I appointed you. And if I say no to what you're going to say now, well, that would make me look pretty stupid. But this is the thing. Now, Sullivan's entire argument is predicated on the fact that no one's arguing the adverse position because now the Department of Justice and Flynn are aligned. So I need somebody to argue the adverse position. And now I forget who I had the argument with, but in Canadian law, judges can ask any question they want of their own volition. They can conduct basically whatever inquiry they want of their own volition. So yes. My understanding under Canadian law, that whole argument is absolute nonsense. Sullivan could ask every single one of those questions that he raised in his brief in the absence of an amicus. Is that the same in the U.S.?
Of course, absolutely, and they do it all the time. He's given four law clerks, highly qualified law graduate law clerks from the top law schools, graduate at the top of the class, to do that legal research for him. So what he really wanted was political cover. He wanted somebody else to be able to talk to the press, to leak certain information, to do independent investigations, things that he could not practically do. But it made zero sense, him saying, yes, I'm a federally appointed judge. Yes, I'm given a staff of 4 law clerks, but golly gee, I just don't know how to research the law when both sides are on the same side. He does it every single day. That's his job. That's what he gets a check for.
And I'm also not mistaken that I presume he knows he has the authority to do it from the bench, but if he does it from the bench, it's at the hearing on the motion, and it doesn't add another 4 months of delay that the schedule he set up for the amicus would incur. Possibly, maybe it's one of the reasons bringing this past November.
Correct. He wanted someone to argue to the press. He wanted someone that could ask for subpoenas. That's his main objective. And to some degree, because he's not bright, he did want someone that was maybe more skilled than him to make the argument than he thought he or his clerks could make. The problem is with his law clerks, I've long argued to federal judges, you can hire 2 young kids, but go out and hire 2 long-standing lawyers to also be your law clerks that have seen real world, because they'll give you better balanced information about how to interpret both the law and to interpret what's happening in court when you need that additional contribution. He doesn't have that. So he has 4 kids and himself. To his credit, he knows he's not the brightest bulb on the block, and he doesn't trust his clerks to know how to weasel his way out of what he wants to get into. But that wasn't his primary objective. What people didn't realize, his primary objective is, as a judge, he cannot leak to the press. A counsel that he hires on his behalf can leak to the press. So they can talk to the press, they can plant stories in the press, and so on and so forth. That's what he's trying to do, in my view.
Okay, it's phenomenal. Now, I'm going to say that Tailix001, I think I missed your super chat. Ask the question again. Don't put it in a super chat so I can get to it. My apologies. It's Real Bambunga says, wouldn't giving him well-educated clerks be an obvious pathway to partisan decisions? Why not provide him with 4? Okay. I knew it was going to be a joke by the end of it, Bambunga.
There's some chimpanzees that could write some better opinions than I've seen some clerks write in the last 10 years. I'll put it that way.
What do you think of my prediction? What do you think the Court of Appeal is going to do? Are they going to?
It's all about the panel. There's only one Obama judge. The one Obama judge will rule in Sullivan's favor. The key is the Trump judge will rule in Trump's favor. The old school Reagan judge, he's going to rule in Flynn's favor. I shouldn't say Trump's favor, Flynn's favor. So I think it will be a 2-1 decision, issuing the writ as requested.
Issuing the writ, not referring it back so that Sullivan adjudicates on the DOJ's motion to dismiss.
They're not going to tolerate that. It sets too bad a precedent. Particularly, I think it offended the old Reagan judge. My guess is he writes the opinion, and his point is, hey, judges, don't be thinking about doing this nonsense in the future. We're going to publicly slap you when you do, so that you're sufficiently embarrassed to think, okay, I'm not going to try that tactic again.
Okay, did I miss anything? Robert, did I miss anything with the Sullivan? I mean, it's
just that legal is fake news.
The problem is I was going to do a response to legal on one of the Flynn stories, but I don't want to look like at some point I feel guilty. I don't want to look like I'm just trying to ostracize him. But I watch it. It's like it's not just spin. It's misinformation in a way that is. My biggest concern is just being wrong on the internet, because you can't take it away. And if it's an unforgivable mistake, unforgivable in the sense like, a negligent mistake, it's a problem. But I'm reading this and I read through it, and it's like, where am I making a mistake here? This is terrible. The one thing I forgot to mention, 2 things actually, is that the attorney that Sullivan appointed is in fact paid for by taxpayer dollars. It appointed under some provision of law that I wasn't sure what it was. And then the other thing was that Sullivan's attorney is the attorney representing Cheryl Mills.
Yeah, it's a close world after all. So there's no question. I've still never seen a judge appoint a lawyer in that situation. So I get that there's a statute somewhere that allows certain aspects of it, but it's in my view not being properly applied in this context. I've never seen a judge do this. I've seen judges assign lawyers. If I'm a member of a court, I'll get some judges who like to screw with me by trying to assign me some terrible case. So like, hey, you could do this case. Usually I find a Boston legal way out of it. People want to watch Boston Legal to figure out what it means. But I've still never seen anything like what this judge did. But what Legal is doing, he's heavily promoted by YouTube. Every time I log on, they are bombarding me with his videos, and they've been doing this now for a year and plus. When I watched him, I was like, first of all, I've never heard of this guy. And then I watched him like, this is not informed analysis. This is like a knockoff CNN legal analyst who went to law school, never practiced law. Now, it looks like he's practiced a little bit. I'd emphasize a little bit in terms of real practice in the real world. But when he made the basic, there was the crying thing with Adam Schiff. So the closing argument is so moving. I was like, I mean, come on, even lefties can't even do that with a straight face. And then it was one after the other. Like, he was very aggressive with Tulsi Gabbard's suit, but then very protective of Democratic suits. I was like, okay, this is just political analysis that has almost no substantive legal analysis. About half the time it will have at least some of what you could find on a Google, but half the time it's just bad analysis. And then the Flynn analysis was atrocious, because he suggested towards the end of this video that Flynn committed treason, which is literally ludicrous if you understand the law of treason. I tell my friends on the right that when they're like, hey, let's bring Obama treason or Hillary Clinton. It's like, treason can only happen when we're in a war, or we have to have declared actual war against them. Otherwise, treason is not illegal. And for very good First Amendment reasons, we keep it that way. But when he said that at the end, I was like, that's just a ludicrous allegation. Well, and when he made the statement about, he's got complete carte blanche to do what he wants. It's like, that's just false. That's false news. That's fake news.
No, and people are gonna come out and thinking he's the judge, he gets to decide, and he had good reasons. There were no adverse positions, so he appointed his own prosecutor. I mean, it's exactly usurping the role of the executive branch. And
YouTube is promoting it. Google is promoting it. So my views, they're promoting. I didn't care as much until I saw how much they're promoting, and he's getting millions of views of some. Like, he has this whole thing about Lafayette Park as the sign of a banana republic, a tin cup dictatorship. It's the deprivation of all rights and liberties. Watch that lawsuit the ACLU brought. They're going to lose that suit. The allegations there are totally weak and not with that merit. And aside from the cry fest that he did, I'm like, this is just purely partisan political news, which I don't mind that as long as you have legal substantive analysis behind it. I disagree with Dershowitz on the constitutionality of forced vaccines, but he'll give you a detailed, logical, legal analysis as to why, and I respect his mind tremendously. It's just that he's just pure fake news. He's a guy that's just going to spread fake stories that push a narrative, and people think it's actually high quality legal analysis. If he's a legal eagle, he got his wings clipped a long time ago.
All right, and now I found Talix's missed super chat previously. Do you think BLM and Antifa have the same long-term goals or temporary allies?
Mostly the same long-term goals. So look up Lord Jamar on Vlad TV, who did an interview relatively recently about why he doesn't like BLM. Also, if you go to go to a list of what BLM's objectives are, there's a group called Leader Think, something like that. If you look up who are BLM's donors, you'll come to a site that tracks all of the criticism of them as well as support of them. But you'll see that any policy that even they've been associated with, and then look up, say, George Soros's beliefs about what he thinks are high priority policies, they almost track precisely. Antifa is a little more disciplined and a little different than that. But put it this way, it's not that BLM isn't as radical as Antifa. It's that in many respects, BLM is more radical than Antifa, at least in terms of their leaders' ideas and organizational principles. They both see George Soros believes the United States and the national identity is the greatest threat to progress in the world. In the same way, BLM sees it the same way, and they see civil rights as their battle axe to condemn the United States of America, which serves all. And there's a reason why George Soros has given over $100 million to them in one way, shape, or form. So he's the number one financial benefactor. It's because they're aligned politically. And Antifa's largely aligned, but Antifa's more hardcore. They're paramilitary trained, anarcho-communists who believe in violence as a means of achieving it, going back to the street violence of the 20s and 30s. And they relate to the Black Bloc group formed. That was mostly a tactic, but they became known as that because of the tactic in the 1970s in West Germany, loosely related to the Black Mass group of the late 60s. That was more of a parody group of anti-war guys who tried to do sabotage as a means of making fun of the system. But that developed, they took that as a sort of an image to emulate the radical German groups. And this was during a time period when you had the Red Brigades in Italy. You had a lot of violent insurrectionary groups that took weather underground in the United States, but took it times 10 in Europe. Or you get like like a lot of your Antifa mindset wouldn't be radically different than the Shining Path of Peru and Bolivia. Best movie to understand them is a mostly fictional movie, but it's mostly factual in what it describes. And that's the movie Dancer Upstairs, one of the best movies on my top 5 list because what it does. So loosely much more aligned than people think, much more shared radicalism than people think.
I just wrote down Dancer Upstairs because that and The Invisible Man are the next 2 things that I'm getting on Audible and renting movies. Okay, I'm going to go through these super chats and then we're going to wind down because it's been 2 hours, Robert. I can't thank you enough. And we're not going to get to answer these super chats, but I'm going to get to them. Along with qualified immunity in regards to police, what about ending civil assets forfeiture?
Oh, yes. I totally agree with that. They're abusing it all over the place. I was at a radical meeting at Howard, which probably got me in my early CIA file, but and someone brought it up to me in the 1990s and talked about it being a major problem in rural Kentucky. And he was right on the cutting edge of it. He was just an ordinary African-American guy from rural Kentucky. He was like, and this was while I was in law school before I had graduated. And he said, Mr. Barnes, he said, you need to look at this. There's sheriffs that are abusing these powers. He goes, one minute they do civil asset forfeiture. The next week, the deputy's driving the truck that they seized. And I dug into it. And it's like, wow, it was a serious problem. I couldn't do much about it at the time, referred it out to other people, but it's only become much, much worse since then.
Okay, amazing. If they fail murder 2, can they still get murder 3?
What you've described about lesser included. Sometimes defense lawyers will argue for no lesser included, and there's ways in which they can do that. It depends on the specific law of the state. Sometimes the reason why a defense lawyer will do that is they want to force the jury to say yes or no across the board when they think they might say yes to something that's lesser, but for their clients, not really that lesser. So I think murder 3 gets you 20 years, I think, in Minnesota.
Okay, very interesting. Jason McConnell waiting on the UFC charity match with Viva Legal versus Barrister Beaver. I would say I would agree. I would say yes, but that might be deemed to be bullying on YouTube. So I got to be careful. We got Soris says, would now after COVID debacle be a good time to push removing sovereign immunity from legislators undercover that maybe even the left would agree on right now?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, I'll be honest, I don't think it will get through, but yes, I agree entirely.
Okay, we got Barnes' podcast is great. We can talk. Robert, we'll stick around for talk for a few minutes after this. Sean Maloney says, hey, from us, gents, legalist fake news clown, I 100% agree. Would like to get your thoughts on the absolute crazy Glenn Kirshner.
Just imagine that guy's been a prosecutor for a long time, and that nut job was deciding what people should get prosecuted. I mean, it's I had my run-ins with Rod Rosenstein. He was at the tax division when every crazy case that I handled ultimately got approved. He embarrassed the tax division with a lot of his bad decisions during that time period. So it doesn't surprise me, but it's still, Twitter, just like Twitter exposed the degree of bias of the media, it showed the degree of problematic behavior in prosecutors, that they are willing to so overtly politicize the law with sometimes insane interpretations to get there. These are people that make legal ego look like an actual legal eagle.
Oh, dear goodness. I seem to have missed all 4 of somebody's super chats. Dan Allen, I did not do it on purpose. See if you can get the questions before we go. Goyo, can Sullivan appeal if motion granted?
Yes. If the writ's granted, he can go up to the U.S. Supreme Court. I don't think he's going to be that dumb. So U.S. Supreme Court's not going to they're not even going to get involved. But if they do, they're not going to reward him. Roberts is not inclined to reward this kind of behavior, unlike the church case where he screwed them over.
Joseph Ruiz says you missed my super chat as well. I apologize, everybody. I'm doing my best. Let me see here. There were 2 more. We got Vicky Rose says, will they make the Coronavirus vaccine on the way mandatory? There's a discussion.
They want to, and they want the military to be the delivery mechanism. But Trump is opposed to it making it mandatory because he recognizes he's got a large part of his base that's a growing part of his base that does not like the idea of somebody in a white lab coat sticking a needle in them. And that it's one thing to have MMR, certain vaccines. Well, MMR is actually controversial now, but there are certain vaccines that do have a long history of success. There are other, but not all vaccines. I recommend people Google 60 Minutes swine flu 1976. That's the last time we rushed a vaccine to deal with a flu like virus. It was a complete disaster. Ended up causing neurological problems, caused far more harm than good. So I'm not a big fan of rushed vaccines. The reason why Trump is for it is he thinks that will get everybody back to work because people have convinced him the only way they'll get back to work is that they think the virus is no longer a threat. Well, look at all the protests. Obviously, the virus is no longer a threat. It's magically cured. It's gone. Look at all the mayors from New York to LA out there without masks even. So hopefully that works. I'm not a fan. I just don't like mandatory vaccines in any context. I understand why that's a very emotional issue for a lot of people.
Especially with untested vaccines that haven't been around for decades, that don't have massive bodies of literature support.
Exactly. That's what I tell people. Every vaccine, it's like somehow we call a drug a vaccine and magically it's reached heavenly heights. And it's like manna from heaven. It's like there are some drugs that are vaccines that work great. There are some drugs that are vaccines that do not work great. We don't want to rush it, period. And I'm against forcing it in any context. I've also never been in favor of any immunity for vaccine makers. My view is, look, if vaccines are really great, like they say, 99.9%, every jury is going to rule your way. It's only if there's something you're hiding that you really need to be immune. It's not the guy that, hey, I've never done anything wrong. Just like the reference to one of your chatters earlier about the shield, I just need a big, long immunity for anything I may have done that may be misinterpreted. And then, of course, the way the shield ends, they realize they've been hooked because it turned out he committed a lot more crimes than they ever imagined. So I just don't like that immunity for vaccine makers.
Okay, John Jen says, what do you think about Andy No suing Rose Antifa? Topic for another day, but it's definitely an interesting one. I want to see if I can get to Dan Allen's super chats that I missed. Dan, by the way, if I don't get to them, I'm sorry, but thank you very much for the support. I thank everybody with these super chats. I never thought I'd come to a point in my YouTube career where I'd have trouble keeping up with super chats. It's encouraging. Are these groups more similar to the Bolsheviks and the Maoists? Okay, I brought that one up before.
Bolsheviks.
Bards, would it be a legitimate case if I sued California Gov for prosecuting me for shooting at a home intruder and demanding me pay their medical bills? By the way, Viva, I love your content.
You'd have to prove wrongful prosecution, unless you could prove failure to protect. But failure to protect is almost impossible unless you're under an order of protection when the incident occurs.
Okay, now let's see if I no. See Sean Maloney. Hey, gents from okay, we got that one. Podcast is great. Okay, now I see if I see Dan Allen's because I'm going to feel guilty about it. But Dan Allen, question: Soros paying legal. I'm glad I got to it. But this is like, it all trickles down somewhere. It's like if you fund an organization that pays for ads on YouTube that appear on somebody's channel.
If I repeated CNN's talking points, I'm sure YouTube would be glad to promote me too. But I think that's the reality of it. Just the fact they got a guy that's, should not have passed law school is unfortunate.
All right, and now I think we're going to end with these two. Do I see three? If they do not make the vaccine mandatory, is there a chance they will limit travel work if it work around making it mandatory? And that's going to be
yes. That was the original 1905 case. It was actually, they didn't make the vaccine mandatory. The Supreme Court approved in 1904, 1905. I think the decision went up. Jacobson, cited unfortunately by Roberts in the latest decision. But it was that he wouldn't have access to Boston if he didn't take the vaccine. So it was a travel limitation as a vaccine as a condition of it. And absolutely, they may make employment. Like right now, most vaccines are not mandatory. It's just you can't get your kid into public school unless they've had a vaccine. And so that's how they do it.
Wouldn't Sullivan appeal ask for hearing en banc? What does that mean?
It means to have the entire DC circuit hear the case rather than that panel. I don't think so, because only if Sullivan wants the embarrassment level to rise. So, it's one thing to try it. You get slapped. Most judges will be like, oh, okay, all right, that didn't work. If Sullivan goes up, he could get slapped harder and heavier and bigger. The risk only increases. So now I think if Flynn loses, Flynn will go to en banc and then the U.S. Supreme Court. Absolutely.
Okay.
I don't know what the nature of the D.C. circuit is right now. I think it's split between Trump, Reagan, and Obama, Clinton.
All right, and we got Barnes. Did you see Glenn Beck's special, The Democrats' Hydra? It put forth some evidence of connection between Antifa and the State Department, specifically Civil Society 2.0. This is I have no knowledge.
I have it flagged, but I have not watched it yet.
Okay, that might make for another future video. Let's see here. Did I just see someone else saying now that I missed? Okay. But I think I've done my best. I hate that I missed the stream. I will watch VOD. Okay. Thanks, Viva. You make things clear in a foggy world. Love your dog shirts. Thank you very much, Mama Moon. Robert, I can't thank you enough for this. We're gonna talk afterwards. I'm gonna have to figure out a way that I can either properly thank you or we can do something. I'm seeing a syndicated television show.
Exactly.
We'll see. But thank you very much, and everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for the super chat and the support. It's amazing. No words to describe it. Robert, stick around for 2 seconds. I'm going to tune out for everybody else. Everyone, thank you very much. Have a good weekend. Stay safe, healthy, avoid trouble, and all the good things. We'll see you soon.